My only daughter married a young Silicon Valley millionaire, and everyone at the lavish estate said they were the absolute perfect couple. The vintage champagne flowed and a string quartet played beneath a massive canopy of imported white silk. But while we were gracefully swaying to the traditional father-daughter dance, I felt her hands trembling uncontrollably. She forced a radiant smile for the flashing cameras, but her eyes were completely terrified. Without breaking her practiced smile, she discreetly slipped a tightly folded linen napkin into my rented tuxedo pocket. As she spun away to be pulled back into her new husband's arms, I stepped into the shadows, reached into my pocket, and unfolded the stiff fabric. Inside, scrawled in frantic, shaking handwriting, was a desperate message that made my blood instantly run cold. It simply read, "Dad, help me, do not let them see you read this." I froze, the beautiful music fading into a dull roar as I watched my new son-in-law grip her arm just a fraction too tightly. Before I continue this story and reveal exactly how I dismantled his entire life, let me know which city or country you are listening from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to fiercely protect the people you love from arrogant people who thought they were untouchable. Now let me tell you how I turned their flawless wedding into the beginning of their total ruin. I am a 67-year-old retired civil engineer. For 40 years, I designed and oversaw the construction of deep foundation support systems for towering commercial skyscrapers across the country. I know exactly what solid ground looks like, and more importantly, I know exactly when a structure is dangerously close to collapsing under its own weight. The Pierce family estate in Napa Valley was a sprawling multi-million-dollar monument to fragile egos and leveraged debt. Hundreds of wealthy guests wandered through the manicured vineyards, holding crystal flutes filled with $1,000 champagne, completely oblivious to the rot beneath the surface. I sat quietly at table number 42, which had been strategically placed right next to the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen. Every few minutes, a frantic waiter would bump the back of my wooden chair as they rushed past with heavy silver trays of caviar and black truffle risotto. I did not complain. I drank my tap water, kept my posture straight, and watched the opulent spectacle unfold around me. I wore a simple, off-the-rack gray suit that I bought a decade ago back home in Michigan. It was clean and pressed, but in a sea of custom Italian tailoring and designer dresses, it made me entirely invisible. That was exactly how I preferred it. I have never needed expensive fabric to validate my worth. But my invisibility did not protect me from the vicious arrogance of the Pierce family. Cameron Pierce, my new son-in-law, was a man who aggressively believed his own press releases. He walked through the crowd with the exaggerated, puffed-out swagger of a young real estate developer who had inherited his initial fortune and desperately wanted everyone in the valley to believe he was a self-made genius. His mother, Victoria Pierce, was a woman carved from pure ice and relentless social climbing ambition. She wore a heavy diamond necklace that cost more than a standard suburban home, and she looked at me as if I were a stray dog that had wandered onto her pristine lawn and ruined the aesthetic. I watched them glide through the crowd, shaking hands with local politicians and minor tech celebrities, performing the exhausting role of American royalty. Eventually, Victoria noticed me sitting alone by the kitchen doors. She broke away from a group of wealthy international investors and marched directly toward my table, her sharp heels sinking slightly into the soft grass. She did not offer a polite greeting or ask if I was enjoying the ceremony. She simply stared down at my scuffed black dress shoes with an expression of profound, unhidden disgust. "Vincent," she said, her voice dripping with venomous condescension, "I see you found your assigned seat. We thought it would be best to keep you near the kitchen staff so you would not feel too out of place among our colleagues. You must be quite exhausted and hungry after flying coach all the way from that depressing little town in Michigan." I did not rise to the insult. I took a slow, measured sip of my water and looked her directly in the eye. "The seating arrangement is perfectly fine, Victoria," I replied evenly. "The food is excellent, and the view of the vineyard is quite clear from here." She scoffed, crossing her arms tightly against her custom designer gown. Yes, well, we certainly spared absolutely no expense for Natalie today. Cameron is an incredibly generous man. He is giving your daughter a life of luxury and status that you could not possibly provide on a civil engineer's meager fixed pension. I sincerely hope you appreciate the massive charity we are extending to your family by bringing her into our circle. I just smiled, offering a thin, meaningless expression that gave her nothing to feed on. Before I could respond further, Cameron strolled over, clapping a heavy, overly aggressive hand onto my shoulder. His grip was entirely too hard, a calculated physical dominance display meant to remind me of my lower place in his new kingdom. "Having fun over here, old man?" Cameron asked loudly, projecting his voice to ensure the nearby tables of wealthy guests could hear him mocking me. "I know this is a whole lot for you to take in. You probably have not seen this much money in one place in your entire life. Just try not to break any of the crystal glasses, all right? We are renting them, and I do not want to deduct the damages from your retirement fund." I looked up at the young man who had just stood at an altar and sworn to protect my only daughter. His eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely devoid of any genuine human affection. He looked at me the way a corporate liquidator looks at an obsolete piece of machinery. "I understand perfectly." "Cameron," I said quietly, keeping my tone perfectly neutral, "I will be very careful with your fragile things." Cameron laughed, a sharp barking sound that grated against my ears and patted my cheek exactly the way one might patronize a slow, confused child. "Good. Enjoy the free meal, Vincent. It really is the absolute least we could do for you." They walked away laughing together as they rejoined their elite circle, leaving me to the loud clattering of kitchen plates. They were entirely convinced that I was a poor dependent pensioner who should be grateful for the crumbs falling from their banquet table. They did not know that I had quietly sold my structural engineering patents 10 years ago for a sum that could buy their entire Napa Valley estate twice over in cash. They did not know I chose to live simply in a quiet Michigan neighborhood because I absolutely despised the exact kind of hollow, toxic opulence they worshipped. I let them believe their comforting illusion of superiority because an arrogant enemy is always a blind enemy. I just wanted my daughter to be happy, and if dealing with their snobbery was the price of her happiness, I was willing to pay it in absolute silence. But as I sat there watching Natalie moving through the massive crowd, greeting strangers with a hollow mechanical grace that seemed entirely unnatural to the fiery girl I had raised, a heavy, suffocating knot of dread began to form deep in my chest. The sun began to set behind the rolling hills of the vineyard, casting a beautiful golden hour glow over the hundreds of oblivious, laughing guests. The head wedding coordinator, a frantic woman wearing a black headset and clutching a thick binder, rushed over to my isolated table near the kitchen doors. She tapped her clipboard aggressively and pointed toward the massive, polished wooden dance floor that had been erected in the absolute center of the lawn. "It is time for the traditional father-daughter dance, Mr. Gallagher," she instructed sharply, her tone implying I was already a burden to her tight schedule. "Please try to follow the lead photographer's hand cues. Keep your jacket buttoned, and whatever you do, do not step on the bride's dress." I stood up slowly, buttoned my modest gray suit jacket, and began the long walk toward the center of the sprawling estate. The crowd parted slightly as I approached, their eyes filled with thinly veiled pity as they watched the supposedly broke pensioner approach his newly wealthy, elevated daughter. The hired string quartet began playing a slow, sweeping classical piece that echoed beautifully across the valley. Natalie stood waiting for me in the absolute center of the polished wood floor, illuminated by a dozen professional photography spotlights. She looked breathtaking in a custom silk gown that undoubtedly cost more than the first house I ever bought. But as I reached out, took her delicate hands, and pulled her into the traditional waltz frame, I immediately felt the horrifying, undeniable truth hidden beneath the layers of expensive fabric and flawless makeup. My daughter was trembling. It was not the light, nervous flutter of a happy bride overwhelmed by the moment. It was the deep, violent, uncontrollable shaking of a trapped animal, realizing the cage door had just locked. Her hands were ice cold, and her fingers dug desperately into the fabric of my shoulder. As we began to sway slowly to the sweeping music, a small army of photographers circled us like vultures, their heavy cameras flashing relentlessly in the twilight. "Smile, Mr. Gallagher," one of the photographers barked from the edge of the floor, waving his hand impatiently. "Look at your beautiful daughter. Act like you are happy." Natalie immediately flashed a brilliant, blinding smile for the camera lenses. It was a perfect, highly practiced expression, radiant and completely terrifyingly hollow. I looked down into her eyes, looking past the heavy mascara and the expensive lighting. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with a silent terror so profound it made my chest physically ache. "Sweetheart," I whispered softly, keeping my own smile firmly fixed in place for the flashing cameras. "What is wrong? You are shaking like a leaf. Are you sick?" She did not answer immediately. She kept her chin high, turning her face slightly so the photographers could capture her perfect profile. But her grip on my shoulder tightened until I could feel her nails through my suit jacket. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a breath, completely drowned out by the sweeping music of the string quartet playing around us. "Dad," she whispered, her lips barely moving to maintain the illusion of the smile. "I made a terrible mistake." I tried to pull back slightly, to look at her directly, to assess the situation, but she forced herself closer to my chest, burying her face near my collar so no one in the crowd could read her lips. "Do not stop dancing," she commanded, her voice cracking with suppressed, suffocating panic. "Keep smiling. Do not look around. They are watching us." I kept my feet moving in a slow, rhythmic box step, my mind racing through 1,000 terrible possibilities. "Who is watching us, Natalie? What is happening here?" She leaned back, pasting that terrifying, flawless smile back onto her face as another barrage of camera flashes hit us. As she spun out for a graceful twirl, she brought her hand down near my waist. When she returned to my arms, pressing close once again, I felt her delicate fingers quickly and discreetly slide a tightly folded piece of stiff linen napkin into the side pocket of my suit jacket. "Read it later," she whispered, her voice trembling so violently I could barely make out the desperate words. "Not here. Not until you are completely alone and locked in your room. He has security everywhere." My blood turned to absolute ice. Security. I am a civil engineer. I understand structural integrity, and I understand the exact moment when the ground is giving way beneath my feet. I knew with absolute terrifying certainty that my daughter was not walking into a marriage. She was walking into a highly orchestrated hostage situation. I held her close for the final agonizing seconds of the song, my mind shifting instantly from a loving, passive father to a man calculating a brutal war. I did not ask any more questions. I simply squeezed her cold hand, letting her know I understood the assignment. "I love you, Natalie," I whispered into her hair, my voice steady and completely calm. "I am right here. You are not alone." The music swelled to its final dramatic chord, and the wealthy crowd erupted into polite, scattered applause. Natalie stepped back, gave me one last desperate look, masked as a loving daughter's gaze, and slowly turned to face her new husband, waiting at the edge of the floor. The applause had barely begun to fade into the cool evening air when Cameron materialized out of the crowded sea of guests. He did not walk over to congratulate us, thank me for the dance, or share a warm family moment. He moved with the swift, aggressive, and highly calculated purpose of a prison warden retrieving an escaped inmate. He stepped aggressively between Natalie and me, completely cutting off my physical access to my daughter. His hand shot out and clamped down hard on Natalie's upper arm. Even under the thick, expensive silk of her wedding sleeve, I could see his knuckles turning stark white from the brutal force of his grip. "It is time to mingle with the venture capitalists," darling, Cameron said. His voice was smooth, loud, and perfectly pitched for the nearby guests to hear, but his eyes were completely dead and devoid of any humanity. "You have spent more than enough time entertaining your father. We have real networking to do if we want to secure the new waterfront project." Natalie flinched slightly at his rough touch, but she immediately nodded, her terrified, robotic smile snapping back into place. "Yes, of course, Cameron," she murmured obediently, her eyes dropping to the floor. Cameron did not even bother to look at me. He simply turned and marched her away into the dense sea of expensive suits and designer dresses, her small frame quickly disappearing into the overwhelming crowd. I took a heavy step forward, my fists clenching instinctively at my sides. I was fully prepared to tear through that wealthy crowd, break his jaw, and drag my daughter out of this toxic estate right then and there. But before I could take a second step toward them, a suffocating wall of cold, expensive perfume blocked my path. Victoria Pierce stepped directly in front of me, accompanied closely by the estate's nervous head catering manager. Victoria held a thick, heavy leather-bound folio in her manicured hands. She thrust it directly into my chest, forcing me to either take it or let it drop awkwardly to the grass. "What is this, Victoria?" I asked, my voice dangerously low and steady. Victoria offered a chilling, aristocratic smirk that did not reach her eyes. "It is the final catering invoice for the cocktail hour, Vincent," she announced loudly, ensuring her sharp voice carried to the wealthy guests lingering at the nearby tables. "Cameron and I discussed it this morning, and we decided that as the traditional father of the bride, you should really contribute at least something financial to your daughter's life today. It is terribly embarrassing for everyone to just watch you sit near the kitchen and eat our expensive food for free." I slowly opened the heavy leather folio. The itemized invoice sitting inside was for exactly $15,000. "Pay the head waiter right now," Vincent, Victoria commanded, turning her back to me with utter, absolute disgust. "Or I will have my private security team escort you off the property for trespassing, and you will not be allowed to say goodbye to your daughter." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or attempt to defend my honor against Victoria Pierce and her venomous public ultimatum. The surrounding guests had grown completely quiet, their eyes fixed on me, waiting for the inevitable humiliation of a poor old man being escorted off the property. They desperately wanted a loud spectacle so they could feel justified in their elite superiority. I refused to give them the satisfaction. Anger is a foolish emotion that blinds you to the mechanics of the room. Instead, I stood perfectly still. I looked down at the heavy leather folio resting against my chest. I calmly reached up and took it from Victoria. She offered a triumphant smirk, entirely convinced she had just won a definitive victory. I let her enjoy her fleeting moment of imaginary power, because an arrogant enemy is the easiest kind to destroy. I slowly reached into the inside breast pocket of my simple gray suit jacket. I did not pull out a worn leather wallet filled with maxed-out credit cards and crumpled bills. I bypassed my personal items entirely and slid my fingers into a hidden secure lining. I withdrew a solid black titanium corporate card. It was completely unbranded, devoid of any flashy banking logos or intricate designs meant to impress common people. It bore only my name and a microscopic embedded security chip. It was an invitation-only asset management card issued directly by a private Swiss financial consortium. It legally represented a liquid credit line large enough to purchase the entire Napa Valley estate we were standing on. I did not hand the card to Victoria. I completely ignored her existence. I turned my attention solely to the terrified head catering manager who was standing nervously behind her shoulder. I extended the heavy metal card toward the catering manager. The man reached out hesitantly, his eyes darting between my cheap suit and the card. As his fingers closed around the titanium, the sheer physical weight of the metal immediately registered in his brain. He looked down at the card, and the blood instantly drained from his face. A senior catering manager at an estate of this magnitude deals with wealthy clients every single day. He knows the subtle difference between a standard platinum card and a private wealth instrument that only the top fraction of a % of the global population is allowed to possess. His eyes widened in absolute shock, and his mouth fell open slightly as he read the name deeply engraved into the dark metal surface. He looked back up at me, his physical demeanor shifting rapidly from condescending annoyance to sheer, unadulterated terror. His hands began to tremble violently, rattling the leather folio. He opened his mouth to speak, to profusely apologize, and loudly announce the terrifying reality of the situation to Victoria and the surrounding crowd. I stopped him instantly. I took one slow step forward, invading his personal space just enough to establish absolute physical authority. I looked directly into his panicked eyes. "Run the card for the full amount," I instructed, my voice completely flat and barely above a whisper yet, carrying the undeniable weight of a direct command. "Add a 20% gratuity for your staff. But you will not say a single word about this transaction to anyone here. You will not mention the color of the card, you will not mention the bank, and you will absolutely not mention my name. If anyone asks you how the bill was settled, you will simply tell them the father of the bride paid the invoice in full." The manager swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously as he nodded his head in rapid agreement. "Yes, sir," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly under the intense pressure of my gaze. "I understand perfectly." I did not wait for Victoria to process the strange, quiet interaction taking place right next to her. I simply turned my back on her and walked away into the crowd. I left her standing on the manicured lawn, confused by my utter lack of resistance, but far too arrogant to investigate the matter any further. I had successfully secured my right to remain on the property without drawing unwanted attention. More importantly, I had bought myself the time and the perfect cover I desperately needed to operate. My daughter was trapped somewhere inside this sprawling gilded cage, and I was going to find her. I left the lawn and stepped into the stone corridors wrapping around the house. The string quartet faded into a hum as I moved away from the lights and crowds. I walked with the measured pace of a man who spent his life navigating active construction sites. The Pierce family and their wealthy venture capitalist guests looked at me and saw nothing but a tired old man in a cheap gray suit holding on to a meager state pension. They assumed my quiet demeanor was the absolute submission of a lower-class citizen overwhelmed by their staggering wealth. They believed my modest Michigan house was the best I could afford after a lifetime of manual labor. They were catastrophically wrong. I did not just pour concrete or weld steel for 40 years. I was the lead structural engineer for some of the most complex, high-rise foundation systems ever built in North America. When visionary architects wanted to build towering glass monuments on unstable seismic fault lines or sinking coastal soil, they called me to ensure their beautiful, fragile dreams did not collapse into dust. I spent my entire career designing the invisible subterranean anchors that held up modern empires. 10 years ago, a massive global construction conglomerate realized they could not replicate my proprietary stabilization methods. They did not hire me. They bought my entire portfolio of exclusive engineering patents. The quiet offshore wire transfer that hit my private asset management accounts that afternoon was large enough to eclipse the entire net worth of the Pierce family 3 times over in liquid cash. I did not buy luxury yachts or fleets of imported sports cars. I did not move to a gated community in California to drink overpriced wine and look down on honest working people. I chose to keep my quiet, unassuming life in Michigan because I deeply understand the corrosive, toxic nature of unearned luxury. I wanted my daughter Natalie to grow up with a profound respect for hard work and a deep understanding of genuine human value. I deliberately hid the massive scale of my wealth in blind trusts and private holding companies because I knew that immense money inevitably attracts ruthless parasites. I just never imagined the ultimate parasite would wear a custom Italian tuxedo and convince my beautiful daughter to marry him. Cameron Pierce looked at my calloused hands and my off-the-rack suit and saw an incredibly easy target. He saw a man with no financial resources, no political connections, and no physical ability to defend his only child. He looked at me and assumed I was a decaying wooden fence he could simply kick down to get exactly what he wanted. He did not realize he had just kicked a solid steel-reinforced blast wall. I navigated the complicated labyrinth of the sprawling estate with practiced ease. The massive house was designed for grand visual impact rather than practical security. I bypassed 2 private security guards by walking straight through the hidden service corridors with absolute authority. People only question those who look like they are afraid or lost. My cheap suit made me look like an invisible maintenance worker checking the electrical fuse boxes. I climbed the heavy oak staircase to the 2nd floor, moving silently along the plush, carpeted hallway. The tall walls were lined with ridiculously expensive abstract paintings and heavy antique mirrors, but I paid them no attention at all. I was analytically scanning the architecture, looking for the primary bridal suite. I knew Natalie had been aggressively escorted inside the main house to prepare for the evening reception. As I carefully approached the far end of the isolated eastern wing, the heavy oppressive silence of the empty hallway was suddenly broken by a muffled sound. It was the distinct sound of a heavy solid wood door being slammed shut and locked from the inside. I stopped moving and pressed my back against the cool plaster wall. I had found the bridal suite. The architectural layout of the floor plan told me there was no other exit from that specific room. She was entirely trapped in there with him. My breathing slowed as I calculated my next exact move. I was no longer a guest at a celebration. I was an engineer standing at the base of a condemned building, preparing to strategically demolish it from the inside out. I slowly crept toward the locked wooden door, sliding my footsteps silently across the thick carpet to listen to the nightmare unfolding on the other side. I pressed my ear against the heavy oak door and listened to the shallow, panicked breathing on the other side. I gently tapped my knuckles against the wood in a specific rhythmic pattern. It was a secret knock I had taught Natalie when she was a little girl hiding from thunderstorms. The frantic breathing stopped instantly. I heard the sharp click of the brass deadbolt sliding back, and the door opened just an inch. Natalie peered through the narrow crack, her eyes completely bloodshot, and her expensive mascara running down her cheeks in dark, jagged lines. When she saw it was me, she pulled me inside with surprising strength and immediately locked the heavy door behind us. The luxurious bridal suite was in a state of absolute chaos. The expensive imported floral arrangements had been violently swept off the tables, and her custom designer wedding veil lay crumpled on the cold marble bathroom floor like a discarded rag. Natalie backed away from me until she hit the edge of the large porcelain vanity. She wrapped her bare arms tightly around her stomach, as if she were physically trying to hold her organs together. "Dad, he is not who we thought he was," she whispered, her voice trembling so violently the words barely formed in the quiet room. "He is a complete monster." I stepped closer and placed both of my hands firmly on her shaking shoulders to physically anchor her. I kept my voice incredibly calm and entirely devoid of panic. "Tell me exactly what is happening, Natalie. Do not give me emotions right now. Give me the pure structural facts." She took a jagged, suffocating breath and looked up at me with absolute despair. "Cameron is completely broke. His entire Silicon Valley real estate empire is nothing but a massive, elaborate illusion built on toxic debt and high-interest loans from extremely dangerous private creditors. The luxury sports cars, the downtown penthouse, the sprawling vineyard we are standing in right now, none of it actually belongs to him. It is all heavily mortgaged or leased to maintain the arrogant facade of a tech genius. His primary holding company secretly collapsed 3 months ago, and the venture capitalists he was bragging to downstairs are actually the men coming to liquidate his entire life. I absorbed this horrifying information without a single change in my facial expression. "Why did he marry you then?" I asked quietly. "If he is drowning in millions of dollars of aggressive debt, a lavish multi-million-dollar wedding is the absolute last thing a rational man would orchestrate." A fresh wave of tears spilled over her eyelashes, dripping onto the silk bodice of her dress. He did not marry me for love, Dad. He married me because his corporate lawyers and private investigators dug into my background and found the blind trust you set up for me when I was a child. He knows about the 500 acres of prime, undeveloped commercial land you put in my name. He knows it is completely debt-free and legally impenetrable as long as I remain a single independent woman. But as my legal husband, he can use a specific marital leverage loophole to bypass the trust restrictions if he gets my direct signature on a joint asset transfer agreement. The architecture of his trap was brutally elegant and entirely sociopathic. He had aggressively love-bombed my daughter, isolated her from her sensible friends, and artificially rushed the wedding timeline to secure his only remaining financial lifeline. He desperately needs the land, Natalie continued, her voice dropping to a terrified, hoarse whisper. He has already illegally pre-sold the development rights to a cartel of ruthless international investors to cover his underground debts. He promised them the deed by Monday morning. If he does not deliver the land, they are going to physically destroy him. And now he is telling me that if I do not sign the irrevocable transfer documents tonight, he will completely ruin my life. He said he will forge documents to frame me for his corporate fraud and pay his private doctors to violently commit me to a locked psychiatric ward. I felt a cold, familiar, absolute rage settle deep into my bones. It was the exact same icy clarity I felt when I discovered a fatal structural flaw in a high-rise foundation. I knew exactly what needed to be done. Cameron Pierce thought he had successfully cornered a naive young girl and her useless, poor old father. He genuinely believed his aggressive timeline and his physical intimidation would force our complete and silent surrender. "Do not shed another tear, Natalie," I said, my voice entirely stripped of any gentle parental warmth and replaced by the ruthless calculation of an engineer preparing for war. "Tears are a complete waste of water when the house is on fire. You are not going to a psychiatric ward, and Cameron is not getting a single square inch of your land." She looked at me desperately, searching my eyes for some kind of magical escape route. "What can we do, Dad? We are completely trapped in his house and his paid security team is stationed everywhere." "We are not trapped," I corrected her smoothly, wiping a stray tear from her cheek. "We are simply standing quietly inside the blast radius." I looked at my daughter, analyzing the absolute terror in her eyes. There was no time to offer comforting platitudes. We were operating in a highly volatile environment, and the enemy held the immediate tactical advantage. Before I could give her the precise instructions for our extraction protocol, the heavy silence of the isolated wing was violently shattered. It started as a low rhythmic thud, echoing down the long carpeted hallway. Heavy footsteps. Not the polite, measured walk of a wandering wedding guest. These were the aggressive, synchronized strides of men moving with absolute hostile purpose. The heavy footsteps stopped directly outside the thick oak door of the bridal suite. Natalie gasped, her cold hands flying up to cover her mouth as the brass doorknob rattled violently. A heavy fist began pounding against the thick wood, the sound echoing like a hammer strike inside the quiet room. "Natalie, open this door right now," Cameron demanded. His voice was no longer the smooth, charismatic purr he had used to charm the venture capitalists downstairs. It was a vicious, jagged snarl dripping with raw malice and cornered desperation. "I have 2 of my private security contractors standing right here with me, and we are not playing this pathetic little game anymore. I brought the asset transfer documents and the pen. If you do not unlock this door in exactly 5 seconds, my men are going to kick it completely off its hinges, and I promise you, the consequences for your reputation will be severe." Panic completely consumed Natalie. She looked around the enclosed room like a trapped bird, her eyes darting between me and the rattling door, fully expecting me to step forward and physically fight them to protect her. But a seasoned structural engineer knows you never stand directly beneath a falling steel beam. You step aside, let the enemy overcommit their momentum, and study their exact point of failure. If I fought them right now, it would be a chaotic physical altercation. I would be immediately arrested by his guards for assaulting the groom. Natalie would be completely isolated again, and Cameron would easily spin the narrative to his wealthy friends and the local police. I needed absolute, undeniable proof of his extortion. I grabbed Natalie by the shoulders, grounding her chaotic energy, and pushed her gently but firmly toward the center of the room. I pointed directly at the heavy floor-to-ceiling velvet curtains covering the massive sliding glass doors that led out to the dark balcony. I backed away, slipping silently behind the thick fabric, completely concealing my presence in the deep shadows just a fraction of a second before a deafening crash shook the entire suite. The heavy oak door splintered inward with a violent crack, and Cameron marched into the room, completely unaware that his ultimate executioner was standing quietly less than 10 feet away. The heavy oak door did not just open, it shattered inward with a violent, deafening crack that sent sharp splinters of wood flying across the plush carpet. I stood perfectly still behind the thick velvet curtains, controlling my breathing with the disciplined precision of a man who has spent decades working in high-altitude construction environments. Through a narrow gap in the heavy fabric, I watched Cameron march into the center of the ruined bridal suite. The polished, charismatic mask he had worn for the wealthy venture capitalists downstairs was completely gone. In its place was the raw, terrifying face of a cornered predator. He was flanked by two massive private security contractors, wearing dark tailored suits and communication earpieces. They stepped into the room, their eyes scanning the corners with professional, cold detachment, but they did not look behind the curtains. Cameron snapped his fingers, a sharp, arrogant sound, and pointed toward the broken doorway. "Stand outside and make absolutely sure no one comes down this hallway," Cameron ordered his men, his voice dripping with pure venom. "If any of the catering staff or the wedding guests try to see what the noise was, tell them the bride simply tripped and knocked over a heavy table. Nobody interrupts us." The two massive guards nodded in silent obedience and stepped backward into the hallway, pulling the splintered remains of the heavy door partially shut to block the view from the corridor. Cameron was now completely alone in the room with my daughter, entirely unaware that the most dangerous man in the entire estate was standing just a few feet away, obscured by the deep shadows of the balcony. I slowly and silently reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and retrieved my smartphone. I bypassed the security lock screen and opened the highly encrypted audio recording application I used to document complex structural engineering meetings. I pressed the red recording circle and slipped the device back into my breast pocket, ensuring the sensitive microphone was perfectly positioned to capture every single syllable of the nightmare that was about to unfold. Cameron walked slowly toward the marble vanity where Natalie was standing and trembling. He did not look at her with the eyes of a loving new husband. He looked at her the way a desperate gambler looks at his last remaining chip. He reached into his tailored tuxedo jacket and pulled out a thick stack of densely printed legal documents. He slammed the heavy papers down onto the marble surface with a loud, aggressive crack. He pulled a sleek silver pen from his pocket and threw it down right next to the papers. "Sign the irrevocable asset transfer right now, Natalie," Cameron commanded, his voice cold, flat, and entirely devoid of any human empathy. "I am completely done playing the patient, loving groom. My international investors are sitting downstairs right now drinking my expensive champagne, and they are expecting absolute confirmation that the 500 acres of commercial land will be legally transferred to my primary holding company by Monday morning. If I do not walk out of this room with your signature on that dotted line, my entire corporate empire collapses, and the violent men I owe money to will not just take my properties, they will end my life." Natalie pressed her back against the large vanity mirror, her breathing shallow and frantic. "You lied to me, Cameron," she sobbed, her voice cracking under the suffocating weight of his betrayal. "You planned this entire elaborate wedding just to steal the only thing my father ever gave me. That land is a protected trust. I cannot just sign it away to cover your illegal underground debts." Cameron laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that echoed terrifyingly in the quiet room. You naive, stupid girl, he sneered, stepping aggressively into her personal space and leaning over her to establish absolute physical dominance. Did you really think I wanted to marry a boring, unsophisticated woman from a miserable little town in Michigan? I tolerate you because your signature is the exact key I need to unlock a $100 million development deal. And you are going to give me that key right now, or I am going to make the rest of your pathetic life a living hell. Natalie shook her head, her hands gripping the edge of the marble counter. I will not sign it, she whispered fiercely. I will walk downstairs right now, I will find my father, and I will tell every single one of your wealthy guests exactly what kind of absolute fraud you really are. Cameron did not flinch. He simply smiled, a terrifying dead expression that sent a chill down my spine. You are not going anywhere, Natalie, he replied smoothly, his tone shifting from aggressive anger to a sickening, calculated calm. Do you honestly think I would orchestrate an operation of this magnitude without building a fail-safe? If you refuse to sign these papers, I will immediately summon Dr. Aris, my private physician, who is currently enjoying a cocktail by the pool. He is heavily compensated by my payroll, and he has already drafted an emergency 72-hour involuntary psychiatric hold with your exact name on it. Natalie gasped, the blood draining completely from her face as the full horror of his trap finally became clear to her. You cannot do that, she breathed, her eyes wide with absolute panic. I am perfectly sane. No one would ever believe you. Everyone will believe me, Cameron countered, his voice dripping with arrogant certainty. You are a highly stressed, emotionally fragile bride who just suffered a massive, violent, psychotic break during her own wedding reception. You destroyed this beautiful suite, you knocked over the expensive floral arrangements, and you became a severe physical danger to yourself and others. I will play the role of the tragic, devastated husband perfectly. Dr. Aris will inject you with a heavy chemical sedative, and my private security team will quietly strap you to a gurney and load you into an unmarked private ambulance through the service elevator. You will wake up tomorrow morning in a locked, padded room at an exclusive, highly discreet wellness clinic in the mountains. You will have absolutely no access to a telephone, no visitors, and no legal representation. And while you are rotting in that padded cell, I will forge your signature on these exact documents, take your land, and ensure your poor, pathetic father is utterly destroyed if he ever tries to intervene. The sheer sociopathic brilliance of his plan hung heavily in the dead air of the room. He had thought of every possible angle, anticipating her resistance, and building a completely inescapable psychological prison around her. He reached out, grabbed her trembling hand, and forcefully shoved the silver pen into her fingers. You have exactly 10 seconds to make your final choice, Natalie. Cameron whispered, his face mere inches from hers. You can sign the paper right now, walk downstairs, and pretend to be my happy, beautiful wife for the next 6 months, until I quietly file for a discreet divorce. Or you can refuse, and I will have you chemically restrained and dragged out of this estate like an insane animal. 5 seconds, Natalie. Make your choice. I stood behind the heavy velvet curtains, every single muscle in my body coiled tightly as I watched my daughter break under the unimaginable pressure. She looked down at the documents, tears streaming silently down her face, and her trembling hand slowly lowered the pen to the signature line. She signed her name, sealing the transfer of the 500 acres, completely unaware that her signature was absolutely legally useless against the counterstrike I had already planned. Cameron snatched the papers from the counter, checked the signature with a triumphant, greedy smirk, and turned toward the broken door. Wash your face and fix your makeup, he ordered coldly over his shoulder. You have 5 minutes to get back downstairs and cut the cake. He walked out of the room, leaving her shattered on the floor, while the encrypted recording of his entire federal extortion plot burned safely in my pocket. The splintered remains of the heavy oak door scraped loudly against the carpet as Cameron pulled it shut behind him. His heavy footsteps echoed down the long hallway, growing fainter until the oppressive silence returned to the ruined bridal suite. Natalie collapsed onto the cold marble floor, pulling her knees to her chest, as she sobbed uncontrollably. She had just signed away her entire future under the threat of being locked in a psychiatric ward. She was completely broken. I waited for exactly 10 seconds to ensure Cameron and his guards were entirely gone. Then I stepped out from behind the heavy velvet curtains. I did not rush to my daughter and pull her into a comforting embrace. I did not offer her gentle words of parental reassurance or promise to immediately carry her out to my rental car. A warm embrace would only validate her panic, and panic is a fatal vulnerability. I walked over to the marble vanity, picked up the silver pen Cameron had forced her to use, and placed it neatly into my pocket. Natalie looked up at me, her eyes red and pleading. She reached out her hand, expecting me to pull her up and declare that we were leaving this nightmare immediately. "Get up, Natalie," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotional warmth. "Fix your dress and dry your tears. We are not leaving this estate tonight." She stared at me in absolute shock. "What are you talking about, Dad?" she whispered frantically. "He just stole the land. We have to go to the police right now and tell them he forced me to sign those transfer documents. If we go to the local police tonight, Cameron will simply show them the signature and call his private doctor," I explained coldly. "He will claim you are having a manic episode and you will be in a locked hospital ward before midnight. The police cannot dismantle a federal corporate fraud scheme on a Saturday night. I need time to completely destroy the foundation of his empire, and you are going to give me that time. You are going to wash your face, walk downstairs, and play the absolute perfect obedient wife for exactly 48 hours." She shook her head violently, terrified by the sheer magnitude of the task I was demanding of her. "I cannot go back down there and smile at him," she cried. "You can, and you will," I stated, stepping closer and looking directly into her eyes. "You will smile for the cameras, you will cut the expensive cake, and you will not show a single drop of fear. Let Cameron believe he has completely won. Let him finalize his illegal deals. The signature you just gave him is legally useless without the original deed, but he does not know that yet. Go back downstairs and be his beautiful trophy wife until Monday morning. By the time Monday noon arrives, there will be nothing left of Cameron Pierce." I waited in the ruined bridal suite for exactly 10 minutes after Natalie walked out the door. I needed to be absolutely certain the hallway was completely clear and that Cameron had returned to his wealthy venture capitalist guests downstairs to play the role of the perfect husband. When the silence in the corridor was absolute, I stepped out of the room and made my way back through the hidden service corridors. I walked with the steady, measured pace of a man who did not belong there, bypassing the private security guards once again by slipping quietly through the busy catering exit. I walked across the dark, manicured lawns and approached the valet station. The young attendant looked at my cheap gray suit with a hint of confusion, but he retrieved my modest rental car without asking any questions. I drove away from the sprawling, illuminated estate, leaving my only daughter behind in the center of that gilded cage. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt for leaving her there. I felt the cold, mechanical certainty of an engineer who had just identified the exact structural weakness of a massive enemy fortress. I drove back to my unassuming hotel room on the quiet outskirts of the valley. It was a simple, inexpensive room devoid of any luxury, but it possessed the only two things I required tonight, which were absolute privacy and a high-speed internet connection. I locked the heavy brass deadbolt, closed the thick blackout curtains, and opened my encrypted laptop on the small wooden desk. I connected my secure phone to the terminal and pulled up the private contact file for Desmond Cole. Desmond was not a typical family lawyer who handled minor civil disputes or drafted polite letters of intent. Desmond was a ruthless corporate forensic accountant and a brilliant legal predator who specialized in entirely dismantling corrupt financial empires. He was the man I kept on a very expensive retainer to ensure my offshore trusts remained completely impenetrable and to destroy anyone who attempted to compromise my assets. I initiated the secure satellite call and waited as the heavily encrypted line connected across the country. Desmond answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and entirely alert, despite the late hour on the East Coast. "Vincent," he said evenly, his tone reflecting years of disciplined professional composure. "You are supposed to be drinking expensive champagne and celebrating your daughter's wedding right now. Why are you calling me on the primary encrypted line?" "The wedding is an elaborate corporate fraud, Desmond Wa," replied, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "Cameron Pierce is completely broke. His real estate empire is a hollow shell, and he is drowning in aggressive private debt. He just physically cornered Natalie in the bridal suite and threatened to have a corrupt private doctor commit her to a locked psychiatric facility if she did not sign an irrevocable asset transfer for the 500 acres of commercial land I put in her name 10 years ago." There was a brief, heavy silence on the other end of the line as Desmond processed the massive legal implications of my statement. When Desmond spoke again, his tone had shifted completely from mild curiosity to the cold, calculating cadence of a legal assassin preparing for a strike. "Did she sign the document, Vincent?" "Yes, she did," I answered, watching the audio file compress on my laptop screen. "He forced her to sign it under severe psychological duress. I was standing quietly behind the balcony curtains the entire time, and I recorded the entire extortion plot on my secure phone. I am sending you the encrypted audio file right now." Desmond received the file immediately, and I could hear his fingers flying rapidly across his mechanical keyboard as he began processing the digital data. A forced signature on a marital transfer document is technically legally voidable. Desmond stated, his voice clinical and incredibly precise. But Cameron Pierce knows the standard legal system is incredibly slow. He knows that by the time you hire a local attorney, draft a complaint, and file a standard grievance with the county court, he will have already leveraged the land to save his own life. He needs the physical asset transferred immediately to satisfy a massive debt that is about to crush him. "Exactly," I agreed, watching the digital progress bar complete its cycle on my screen. He bragged to Natalie that he had already illegally pre-sold the development rights to a cartel of ruthless international investors. He promised them the legally binding deed by Monday morning. He plans to use the local county clerk office to push the fraudulent transfer through the municipal system before we have any chance to react. Desmond stopped typing for a moment. "He is moving incredibly fast, Vincent. He wants to secure the external capital and legally lock you out before the commercial banks open on Monday morning. What are your exact instructions for our counteroffensive?" I leaned forward, resting my calloused hands on the cheap wooden desk, and stared at the glowing screen of my laptop. "I do not want to simply block the municipal transfer, Desmond. I want to completely annihilate him. I want you to initiate a total forensic audit of Cameron Pierce and his entire corporate structure. I want you to dig through his offshore privacy firewalls and find the exact holding company he plans to use for the collateral transfer. I need you to track every single penny of his toxic debt. Find out exactly who he owes money to and what regional banks hold his original defaulted loans. I want to know the absolute foundation of his failing financial house by tomorrow morning, so I can legally buy the ground underneath it and watch him fall. I need to know the names of the board members he is working with," I added, ensuring no stone was left unturned. "I want the names of the venture capitalists who attended the wedding today." Cameron operates on the illusion of success, and that illusion relies entirely on the confidence of his peers. When we strike him, we will not do it in the shadows. We will execute his financial destruction in front of the very people he is trying to impress. Desmond agreed instantly, noting that the international cartel Cameron mentioned would likely have a massive digital footprint tied to his recent wire transfers. "Find the connection between his primary holding company and those investors I instructed smoothly. If he has promised them my daughter's land, they are accessories to his wire fraud. Build the entire profile, Desmond. I am going to sleep for exactly 4 hours tonight. When I wake up, I expect to hold the absolute power over Cameron Pierce's entire existence." I closed the encrypted laptop and sat in the dark room listening to the quiet hum of the air conditioner, entirely prepared for the war that Monday would bring. The pale blue light of dawn was just beginning to creep through the gaps in the heavy blackout curtains when my encrypted phone vibrated against the wooden desk. I had not slept a single minute. I picked up the device and answered immediately. Desmond did not bother with a polite morning greeting. His voice was grim and entirely devoid of his usual professional detachment. "Vincent," he said evenly, "you were absolutely correct about the international investors, but the reality is far more dangerous than a standard corporate fraud scheme. I spent the last 4 hours tearing through Cameron Pierce's offshore financial firewalls. The venture capitalists he was parading around the wedding reception are not legitimate businessmen. They are high-level representatives for a ruthless international cartel that launders illicit money through commercial real estate development." I listened in absolute silence as the true architecture of Cameron's desperation finally became clear. He did not just promise them the 500 acres, Desmond continued, his keyboard clicking rapidly in the background. 3 weeks ago, Cameron accepted a $20 million non-refundable cash advance from their shell companies to keep his failing luxury properties afloat. He used your daughter's land trust as the absolute collateral for that illegal loan. He guaranteed the syndicate that the legal title would be completely transferred into their primary holding company the moment the county clerk office opens on Monday morning. The sheer magnitude of my new son-in-law's stupidity was staggering. He had knowingly climbed into a cage with apex predators and offered them meat he did not even own. If Cameron does not physically deliver that deed by Monday morning, they will not take him to civil court. I stated, my voice cold and analytical. They will physically eliminate him, Desmond confirmed instantly. And because Natalie is legally tied to him as his new wife, they will hold her entirely responsible for the missing $20 million. They will tear her life apart to recover their investment. Vincent, we are completely out of time. It is Sunday morning right now. We have exactly 24 hours before the county clerk opens their massive glass doors. If Cameron successfully files that extorted signature tomorrow morning, the cartel legally acquires the land, and your daughter is permanently chained to a massive federal money laundering conspiracy. I looked out the hotel window at the sun rising over the distant manicured vineyards. Cameron thought he had until Monday to comfortably execute his trap. He did not realize I was already inside the walls of his collapsing empire. Draft the emergency injunctions, Desmond first ordered, my voice hardening into absolute stone. I am going back to the estate this morning. I am going to play the role of the defeated father one last time and walk directly into his trap. We have exactly 1 day to completely sever my daughter from a dead man walking. I drove my modest rental car back through the towering wrought iron gates of the Pierce estate just before 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. The sprawling manicured lawns had been completely transformed overnight by a small army of exhausted catering staff. The massive white silk tents from the wedding reception were gone, and in their place were elegant open-air dining tables covered in crystal pitchers of expensive mimosas and towering displays of imported pastries. The wealthy venture capitalists, the local politicians, and the international real estate investors had returned wearing expensive casual linen suits and designer sunglasses, ready to celebrate the first official day of Cameron and Natalie's supposedly perfect marriage. I parked my car near the service entrance and walked slowly toward the garden, intentionally hunching my shoulders and dragging my feet just a fraction of an inch to project the exact image of a tired, defeated old man who had completely surrendered to his new reality. I spotted my daughter sitting at the head of the longest dining table beneath the shade of a massive oak tree. She was wearing a beautiful flowing white sundress, and her hair was styled perfectly to hide the deep exhaustion in her eyes. She was executing my instructions from the night before with absolute flawless precision. She smiled radiantly at the wealthy guests. She laughed politely at their hollow corporate jokes, and she kept her hands resting gently over Cameron's arm. Only a father who had known her for her entire life could see the sheer mechanical terror vibrating underneath her perfect posture. Cameron sat beside her, overflowing with arrogant charisma. He kissed her cheek, he poured her champagne, and he soaked in the admiration of his powerful peers, completely convinced that his brutal extortion from the night before had entirely broken her spirit. The absolute moment Cameron saw me approaching the tables, his charismatic smile widened into a terrifyingly perfect mask of welcoming affection. He stood up immediately and walked across the manicured grass, opening his arms wide as if greeting a beloved, respected patriarch. "Vincent," he called out loudly, ensuring the surrounding tables of wealthy investors paused their conversations to watch the touching display of family unity. "I am so glad you made it back this morning. You look completely exhausted from the heavy festivities. Come with me for a moment. I want to show you something privately inside the main house before we sit down to eat." He clamped his heavy hand onto my shoulder, his fingers digging sharply into my collarbone, and physically steered me away from the crowd. Natalie watched us go, her eyes flashing with a brief moment of absolute panic, but she quickly turned back to the guests and forced another radiant, empty smile. Cameron guided me through the massive glass doors of the estate and down a long, quiet corridor lined with aggressively expensive modern art. We stopped at a set of heavy, dark mahogany doors at the far end of the hall. He pushed them open and shoved me roughly inside before stepping in and locking the heavy brass deadbolts behind us. The room was his private executive study. It was an intimidating, masculine space filled with dark leather furniture, walls of unread antique books, and a massive mahogany desk dominating the center of the room. The absolute moment the heavy locks clicked into place, the warm, charismatic son-in-law completely vanished. His posture straightened, his face hardened into a mask of pure, cold contempt, and he walked over to a crystal decanter on his desk to pour himself a heavy glass of amber liquid. He did not offer me a seat. "You are leaving California today, Vincent," Cameron announced, his back turned to me as he took a slow, arrogant sip from his glass. "I have already instructed my executive assistant to book you a coach ticket back to your miserable little house in Michigan. Your flight leaves at 4:00 this afternoon." I stood near the heavy doors, keeping my head slightly bowed and my hands clasped nervously in front of me. "Where is Natalie going?" I asked, my voice deliberately trembling to sell the illusion of a weak, frightened father who knew he had lost. Cameron turned around and leaned casually against his massive desk, swirling the expensive liquor in his glass. "Natalie is going to be taking a brief hiatus from her new social responsibilities," he stated, his voice completely devoid of any human empathy. "She was incredibly erratic last night after you left. The stress of the wedding and the emotional burden of dealing with your pathetic presence completely overwhelmed her fragile nervous system." I looked up at him, widening my eyes in feigned confusion. "What are you talking about, Cameron? She looked perfectly fine out there just now." "She is heavily medicated, Vincent," he countered smoothly, offering a sickeningly perfect smile. "Dr. Aris examined her late last night and determined she is suffering from a severe acute psychological breakdown. She needs immediate, highly specialized professional care in a completely controlled environment. As her legal husband and her primary medical proxy, I have made the difficult but absolutely necessary decision to send her to an exclusive private wellness clinic located deep in the northern mountains. She will be leaving via private helicopter immediately after the brunch concludes." The sheer sociopathic audacity of his plan was exactly what I had anticipated. He was entirely isolating her to prevent any interference while he finalized the fraudulent land transfer with the cartel. "How long will she be there?" I asked, letting my shoulders slump as if the weight of his words had physically crushed my spine. Cameron stepped forward, closing the distance between us until he was towering over my hunched frame. "She will remain at the clinic for exactly 1 month," he whispered, his voice dropping to a cold, lethal threat. "It is a highly secure facility, Vincent. There are no visitor privileges permitted. There are absolutely no telephone lines, and the entire perimeter is heavily guarded to ensure the complete privacy of their wealthy clients. Do you understand what I am telling you, old man? Your daughter is completely unreachable. She belongs entirely to me now, and you will never see her again unless I explicitly allow it." I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the expensive Persian rug beneath his polished shoes, allowing him to believe his terrifying psychological prison had completely paralyzed me. I did not argue, I did not threaten him, and I did not demand to see my daughter. I simply nodded my head, playing the part of the broken pensioner perfectly, while my mind calculated the exact trajectory of his impending destruction. Cameron walked around the heavy mahogany desk and sank into his plush leather executive chair. He opened the top drawer and pulled out a sleek, dark leather-bound checkbook. He uncapped his expensive silver fountain pen and began to write with aggressive, sweeping strokes. The oppressive silence in the room was broken only by the sharp scratching of the metal nib against the thick paper. I remained standing near the heavy locked doors, keeping my shoulders slumped and my gaze fixed firmly on the woven pattern of the expensive carpet. I knew exactly what he was doing before he even finished writing the date. He was attempting to put a hard financial price tag on my absolute silence. He ripped the check from the binding with a sharp, violent tear and stood up. He walked back around the desk to stand directly in front of my hunched frame. He held the small piece of paper out, holding it between his index and middle finger, like a piece of contaminated garbage he was forcing me to collect. "I have decided to be incredibly generous with you, Vincent," he stated, his voice dripping with sickening, condescending pity. "That is a direct draft for exactly $50,000. It is vastly more money than you have ever held in your calloused hands at one time. I want you to take this money, go straight to the airport, and fly back to your pathetic little life in Michigan. You are going to deposit this into your meager retirement account, and you are going to completely forget that you ever had a daughter." I stared down at the piece of paper fluttering slightly in his arrogant grip. Cameron genuinely believed he was purchasing my permanent absence and my complete submission. He truly thought $50,000 was an astronomical sum that would easily overwhelm the morals and courage of a retired civil engineer. He did not realize that by handing me a direct draft from his personal executive holding account, he was voluntarily handing me the exact digital key my forensic accountant desperately needed. Once I deposited that check into my highly secure proxy accounts, Desmond Cole would be able to use the originating routing data to trace a digital bridge straight back through Cameron's offshore firewalls. Cameron was literally paying for the exact rope I was going to use to hang him on Monday morning. I slowly raised my right hand, ensuring my fingers trembled violently to maintain the flawless illusion of a broken, devastated father. I looked up at him, forcing my eyes to water slightly, as if the sheer emotional weight of his absolute cruelty had finally shattered my spirit. I took the check from his fingers, clutching it tightly against the cheap fabric of my suit jacket. "You are a completely ruthless man, Cameron," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly to sound like a defeated, terrified old pensioner who had completely given up the fight. Cameron simply smiled, a cold, triumphant smirk that radiated pure sociopathic arrogance. "I am a very wealthy man, Vincent," he corrected me, turning his back on me to admire his own reflection in the window glass. "And in this modern world, wealth is the absolute only thing that truly matters. Now turn around and walk out of my house before I have my private security guards physically throw you onto the street." I walked out of the heavy mahogany doors and left Cameron Pierce standing in his executive study. I did not look back to see his smug, triumphant expression. I navigated the busy corridors of the estate and walked straight out to my modest rental car parked near the service entrance. The young valet handed me the keys with a dismissive wave, but I paid him absolutely no attention. I drove off the sprawling property and headed straight back to my quiet hotel room on the edge of the valley. The $50,000 check was sitting in my breast pocket, burning against my chest like a loaded weapon. Cameron genuinely believed it was a gag order. He believed he had successfully purchased my permanent absence and my absolute submission with a single piece of paper. He did not realize that a check drawn directly from a private executive account carries a massive amount of embedded digital information. It contains specialized routing numbers, origin branch identifiers, and hidden transit codes that link directly back to the primary source of the funds. I entered my dark hotel room, locked the heavy brass deadbolt, and immediately opened my encrypted laptop on the small wooden desk. I did not deposit the check into a standard commercial checking account. That would be entirely useless and easily tracked by his accountants. I logged into a highly secure proxy account, managed directly by my private Swiss financial consortium. This specific account was heavily engineered by Desmond Cole to act as a lethal digital snare. It was designed to pull the raw origin data from any incoming deposit and instantly map the exact network architecture of the sending institution. I initiated the secure satellite link and called Desmond on the primary encrypted channel. He answered immediately on the very first ring, his voice tight with focused professional anticipation. "I have the physical check, Desmond," I announced, keeping my voice low and completely steady. He wrote it directly from a private wealth management account under his own name. He did not use an anonymous shell company to issue the funds. His arrogant assumption that I am a harmless old man made him incredibly careless. "Excellent," Desmond replied, the sound of his rapid typing echoing sharply through the phone speaker. "Initiate the secure digital deposit right now, Vincent. I need the raw routing data to establish the connection bridge before his banking cycle resets for the afternoon." I placed the heavy paper check onto the flatbed scanner attached to my laptop and initiated the transfer protocol. The highly encrypted banking software scanned the magnetic ink at the bottom of the check, reading the precise digital fingerprint of his wealth. It sent the encrypted data packet directly to Desmond's secure servers. I watched the progress bar on my screen slowly fill with bright green light. The absolute moment the digital transfer cleared the trap was officially sprung. We now had a direct, verified financial tether connecting my anonymous offshore proxy account straight into the absolute heart of Cameron Pierce and his hidden financial network. "The secure connection is successfully established," Desmond stated, his voice dropping into a cold, mechanical cadence as he went to work. "I am following the routing trace backwards to the origin server. Cameron Pierce uses a private boutique bank in the Cayman Islands to handle his executive liquidity. It is a standard evasion tactic used by amateur real estate developers trying to hide their toxic debt from aggressive domestic auditors." The digital hunt had officially begun. I sat perfectly still in the silent hotel room, staring at the endless lines of scrolling code reflecting on my dark laptop screen. I could hear Desmond breathing steadily through the speaker as he navigated the complex labyrinth of international banking protocols. He was moving silently backwards along the digital bridge the check had just created. He bypassed the superficial domestic clearinghouses and slipped quietly past the initial automated security gates without triggering a single warning. But as he approached the core holding servers, the digital resistance violently increased. "Cameron is not completely stupid," Desmond muttered, his fingers flying across his keyboard with blistering mechanical speed. "He has a massive military-grade offshore firewall protecting his primary ledgers. The encryption protocols are constantly shifting to prevent unauthorized access. If I accidentally trigger the automated alarm system, his bank will immediately freeze all outgoing data, and we will be completely locked out before we can find the cartel money." The tension in the quiet hotel room became absolutely suffocating. I am a civil engineer who deals with physical steel and concrete, but I deeply understand the terrifying pressure of a failing support structure. If Desmond failed to breach the firewall, Cameron would realize he was under digital attack, and he would aggressively accelerate his timeline to finalize the fraudulent deed transfer. "Break the wall." Desmond first commanded, my voice completely devoid of panic. "Do whatever it takes to get inside that server right now." I listened to the frantic, relentless rhythm of his keyboard as he deployed a massive barrage of algorithmic countermeasures. He used the verified signature data from the $50,000 check as a digital skeleton key, forcing the firewall to temporarily recognize his intrusion as a legitimate internal audit request. The seconds ticked by, slowly feeling like heavy, agonizing hours pressing down on my chest. Then the frantic typing suddenly stopped. The heavy silence stretched for a terrifying moment before Desmond let out a low, sharp breath. "I am in," he whispered, his voice filled with cold, triumphant clarity. "The firewall is completely bypassed, and I have unrestricted read access to his absolute core financial ledgers. I am pulling every single encrypted file right now, Vincent. I am looking directly at the cartel wire transfers, the fraudulent property deeds, and the hidden massive debt portfolios. Cameron Pierce is completely exposed. The digital hunt was over. We had successfully breached the impenetrable castle walls, and we were now standing directly inside his vault." The heavy silence of the hotel room was violently broken by Desmond exhaling sharply over the encrypted line. He had found something buried deep within the restricted executive folders of the offshore server. "It is much worse than just the cartel loan," Vincent Desmond stated, his voice tight, with a mixture of professional awe and utter disgust. "I am looking at the municipal development applications for the 500 acres of commercial land." Cameron did not wait for the wedding to start moving the pieces. He submitted the preliminary environmental zoning permits to the State Planning Commission 3 weeks ago. I leaned closer to the glowing laptop screen. "That is legally impossible, Desmond," I replied smoothly. "The State Planning Commission requires a notarized signature from the legal owner of the trust to even open a preliminary environmental review. My daughter did not sign anything 3 weeks ago. She did not even know about his financial trouble until last night." "Exactly," Desmond confirmed, the sound of his rapid typing echoing through the speaker. "He forged her signature, Vincent. He digitally forged her name on 4 separate state zoning applications and transmitted them across state lines to the Federal Environmental Protection Agency to secure early development clearance for his investors. By transmitting those forged documents electronically to a government agency, he just committed 4 undeniable counts of federal wire fraud. This is no longer just a civil dispute over an extorted property deed. Cameron Pierce has blindly walked into a massive federal crime." I felt a cold, grim satisfaction settle deep into my chest. Cameron had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy him completely. "Package the forged permits and send them to my secure drive immediately," I ordered. "We are going to hand this directly to the federal banking authorities on Monday morning." Before Desmond could acknowledge the command, a sudden sharp electronic chime echoed from his end of the line. It was a high-priority digital interception alert from the internal email server we were monitoring. Desmond fell completely silent for a few terrifying seconds as he read the newly intercepted message. "Vincent, we have a massive problem." Desmond warned, his voice suddenly dropping an octave. "Cameron just sent an emergency encrypted calendar invitation to all the senior cartel representatives and his venture capitalist board members. He is not waiting for the standard bank clearing hours to process the paperwork quietly. He has called an emergency mandatory board meeting in his downtown glass high-rise for exactly noon tomorrow." I stared at the dark wall of the hotel room, calculating the terrifying new timeline. "He is aggressively accelerating the collateral transfer," I stated coldly. "He plans to finalize the cartel handover in front of his entire board at noon and use their presence to legitimize the fraudulent acquisition. If we do not completely dismantle his financial foundation before the clock strikes 12 tomorrow, my daughter will be buried under a federal criminal investigation." We were out of time, and the final countdown had officially begun. The sun had completely set over the sprawling vineyards, leaving the Pierce estate shrouded in deep, heavy darkness. I was driving my modest rental car up the winding mountain road, leading back to the property. I had not left my daughter entirely unprotected in that hostile environment. Before I departed the bridal suite on Saturday night, I had discreetly activated the emergency audio monitoring feature on her secure smartphone, linking it directly to the encrypted receiver on my dashboard. I drove in absolute silence, listening intently to the live audio feed transmitting from her bedroom. The entire house was supposed to be asleep, but the digital connection crackled with the terrifying sounds of a trap violently snapping shut. I heard the distinct metallic sound of a heavy zipper being hastily pulled closed, Natalie had reached her absolute psychological limit. Despite my strict instructions to play the obedient wife until Monday morning, the suffocating reality of her situation had completely overwhelmed her. She was packing a small overnight bag, frantically trying to escape the estate under the cover of darkness. But Cameron Pierce was not a man who left his most valuable assets unguarded. The heavy bedroom door swung open with a violent crash that made the audio speaker on my dashboard loudly distort. "Going somewhere so late at night?" Darling Cameron asked, his voice echoing through the quiet room with a sickening, mocking sweetness. I listened as Natalie let out a sharp, terrified gasp, dropping the canvas bag onto the hardwood floor. "I told you to stay in this room until morning." Cameron continued, his tone rapidly shifting from fake sweetness to a cold, jagged threat. "Did you honestly think my private security team does not monitor every single camera on this estate? I knew you were packing the absolute second you pulled that suitcase out of the closet." Natalie tried to speak, but her voice was completely paralyzed by fear. "Please, Cameron," she begged, her words trembling violently through the encrypted feed. "Just let me leave. I signed the transfer papers for the land. You have absolutely everything you want from me. Let me just walk out the front door, and I promise I will never contact you or the authorities again." Cameron laughed, a harsh, cruel sound that lacked any human empathy. "You do not get to dictate the terms of our arrangement, Natalie," he sneered, stepping aggressively into her personal space. "I cannot simply let an emotionally unstable bride wander out into the dark mountains. It would look terrible for my public image. And more importantly, I cannot have you running to the local police before the county clerk office opens tomorrow morning. I warned you exactly what would happen if you tried to defy me again." The sound of a second set of footsteps entered the room. They were slow, measured, and entirely clinical. "Ah, Dr. Aris, please come in," Cameron announced smoothly, entirely dropping his aggressive demeanor to play the role of the concerned husband. "As you can clearly see, my wife is completely out of control. She is frantically packing bags, speaking irrationally, and attempting to flee the property in the middle of the night. I am deeply terrified she is going to physically harm herself." "Good evening, Mr. Pierce," the doctor replied, his voice smooth, professional, and absolutely dripping with corrupt compliance. "I can clearly see the patient is suffering from a severe acute manic episode. Her pupils are dilated, her breathing is shallow, and her behavior is entirely erratic. This is a classic presentation of a massive psychological break brought on by the overwhelming stress of the wedding." He was medically gaslighting her right in front of her face. Natalie began to cry, desperately, pleading with the doctor. "There is nothing wrong with me," she sobbed, her voice cracking under the suffocating weight of their combined manipulation. "He is forcing me to stay here. He is stealing my property. Please, you have to call the police." Dr. Aris completely ignored her desperate pleas. He spoke directly to Cameron with the cold detachment of a man who was being paid an astronomical sum to ignore reality. "Given her severe delusions and her clear flight risk, I am officially authorizing an emergency 72-hour involuntary psychiatric hold," he stated calmly, the scratching sound of a pen on a heavy medical clipboard echoing through the audio feed. "I have my private transport team waiting downstairs. We will administer a mild chemical sedative to ensure she does not injure herself during the transit. We will move her to the secure mountain clinic immediately for a full psychological evaluation." The sheer sociopathic efficiency of their operation was terrifying. They were not just kidnapping her, they were using the absolute authority of the medical system to legally erase her voice. I heard the heavy boots of the private paramedics entering the bedroom. Natalie began to scream, fighting back with everything she had. "No," she shrieked, the sound of breaking glass shattering through the audio feed as she violently shoved a heavy lamp off the bedside table. "Do not touch me. Let me go." "Restrain her immediately," Cameron barked over the chaotic noise, his voice completely devoid of any remaining humanity. "Strap her to the gurney and get her out of my house before she wakes up the remaining guests." I did not panic as I listened to my daughter screaming for her life. Panic is an emotion reserved for men who do not have a plan. I simply pressed my foot down hard on the accelerator, forcing the rental car engine to roar as I crested the final hill of the mountain road. The massive wrought iron gates of the Pierce estate were standing wide open to allow the private ambulance to easily exit the property. I did not slow down. I tore through the entrance tires screaming against the asphalt and drove directly toward the brightly lit front courtyard. The large white private ambulance was idling near the massive front steps. Its back doors swung completely open, waiting to swallow my daughter. I slammed on the brakes, skidding the rental car sideways across the manicured driveway until it came to a violent, shuddering stop, directly behind the ambulance, entirely blocking its only path of escape. The trap had been sprung, but Cameron Pierce was about to realize he was not the one holding the leash. The heavy iron gates of the Pierce estate were still standing wide open when I reached the top of the mountain road. I did not slow down to announce my arrival to the bewildered security guards standing near the entrance. I pressed my foot heavily onto the accelerator and drove my modest rental car straight into the brightly lit circular driveway of the main house. The massive white private ambulance was idling directly in front of the grand marble steps. Its heavy diesel engine rumbled loudly in the cool night air, and the rear doors were swung completely wide open, waiting to swallow my daughter. Two muscular private paramedics dressed in dark tactical uniforms were standing by the back bumper holding a heavy medical gurney with thick leather restraints. Cameron was standing at the top of the stairs, pointing frantically toward the bedroom window, while Dr. Aris clutched his fake medical charts in the shadows. I did not gently pull into a designated visitor parking space. I turned the steering wheel sharply to the left and slammed my foot down hard on the brake pedal. The rental car skidded violently sideways across the pristine gravel, sending a shower of loose white rocks flying into the expensive manicured landscaping. The car came to a shuddering, abrupt stop, perfectly positioned, perpendicular to the massive front grille of the ambulance. I had entirely blocked their only physical exit path from the property. If they wanted to leave the mountain tonight, they would have to drive a heavy medical vehicle directly over the steel frame of my car. The sudden violent noise of the screeching tires immediately stopped the chaotic kidnapping operation. The two private paramedics instinctively reached for the heavy metal flashlights, clipped to their tactical belts. Cameron spun around his face, contorting into a mask of absolute furious disbelief when he recognized my cheap vehicle sitting in his courtyard. "What are you doing here, old man?" he screamed, his voice echoing sharply across the massive open space. "I told you to go to the airport this afternoon. Get your pathetic car out of my driveway right now, or my private security team will physically drag you out of it and throw you down the mountain." I turned off the ignition and placed the keys safely into my pocket. I did not rush out of the car in a blind, emotional panic. I took a slow, deliberate breath, settling my heart rate to the precise rhythmic beat of a man who was entirely in control of the battlefield. I opened the driver door and stepped out onto the crushed gravel. The cool mountain air hit my face, but I felt absolutely nothing but cold, mechanical focus. I smoothed the lapels of my simple gray suit and looked directly up at the men who were trying to destroy my only child. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic screaming. I did not need volume to establish my absolute dominance over the situation. I walked slowly around the front of my blocked vehicle and stood directly in the blinding white glare of the ambulance headlights. "I am not going to the airport, Cameron," I stated, my voice cutting cleanly through the loud rumble of the diesel engine. "And absolutely no one is leaving this estate tonight." Cameron marched down the grand marble stairs with his face flushed in pure, unadulterated rage. He signaled the two massive private paramedics to step away from the heavy medical gurney and deal with me. "Move him right now," Cameron ordered, his voice cracking under the severe strain of his failing control. "Throw him into the bushes and hotwire his pathetic rental car to move it out of the way because we are leaving on schedule." The two men stepped forward, resting their hands intimidatingly on their heavy tactical utility belts. They were entirely used to intimidating frightened family members and compliant hospital staff. They were not used to a man who looked back at them with the cold, dead eyes of a structural engineer analyzing a fatal stress fracture. Before the heavy guards could lay a single hand on my cheap gray suit, Dr. Aris stepped out from the deep shadows of the idling ambulance. He held up a thick, heavy plastic clipboard, attempting to project an aura of absolute medical authority. "Please step aside, Mr. Gallagher," the corrupt doctor instructed, his tone dripping with fake professional concern. "I understand you are deeply upset about your daughter's sudden mental collapse, but you are currently interfering with a critical medical transport. I have personally evaluated Natalie and officially signed a mandatory 72-hour involuntary psychiatric hold. She is a severe danger to herself and to others. If you continue to block this ambulance, I will have no choice but to call the local authorities and have you arrested for obstructing a licensed medical professional during an emergency operation." I looked at the doctor and kept my expression completely blank. I did not yell that my daughter was perfectly sane or try to violently push past him. I let him formally declare his fraudulent medical diagnosis out loud in front of multiple witnesses. "You are absolutely certain of your medical evaluation?" "Dr. Aris," I asked, my voice incredibly quiet and measured against the loud rumble of the diesel engine. "You are officially diagnosing her with a severe acute psychotic break right now on the gravel driveway of this estate without conducting a single blood test or proper psychological review." Dr. Aris puffed out his chest, completely confident in his purchased authority and the massive sum of money Cameron had paid him to look the other way. "I am a board-certified physician," he sneered condescendingly. "My professional medical evaluation is absolute and legally binding. Cameron is her legal husband, and he has granted me full medical proxy to make these difficult decisions for her own physical safety. Now move your vehicle before things become violently unpleasant for you." Cameron smirked and crossed his arms in absolute triumph. He genuinely believed his legal marriage certificate gave him complete, undeniable ownership over my daughter's life and her physical body. He believed his trap was flawlessly executed. But an engineer never enters a collapsing structure without building a reinforced emergency exit route. I reached into the inside pocket of my suit jacket and slowly withdrew a neatly folded piece of heavy legal paper. I unfolded it deliberately and held it up directly in the blinding glare of the ambulance headlights so the corrupt doctor could clearly read the bold black text printed across the very top of the page. When I found Natalie locked in the bridal suite yesterday afternoon, I knew Cameron would inevitably try to weaponize the medical system against her. He had openly threatened to throw her into a psychiatric ward to keep her quiet and isolated. So before Cameron kicked the oak door off its hinges, I did not just tell Natalie to hide me behind the velvet curtains. I pulled a blank emergency revocation of spousal medical rights from my breast pocket. It is a highly robust standard legal document my forensic accountant Desmond Cole insists I carry at all times when dealing with hostile corporate environments. While the heavy door was rattling, I forced a silver pen into her trembling hand and made her sign the bottom line. With that single frantic signature, Natalie completely stripped Cameron Pierce of all medical decision-making power and legally reinstated me as her absolute sole medical proxy. I held the signed document directly in front of the doctors, face-tapping the signature line with my index finger. "This is an irrevocable medical power of attorney, signed and dated by my daughter before you ever set foot on this property." I stated, my voice completely devoid of any mercy or hesitation. "It clearly states that Cameron Pierce has absolutely zero legal authority to authorize medical treatments, psychiatric evaluations, or facility transfers on her behalf. I am her sole medical proxy, and I am explicitly denying your fraudulent psychiatric hold right now." The blood instantly drained from the corrupt doctor's face. His eyes widened in absolute sheer terror as he read my daughter's messy but undeniably authentic signature at the bottom of the page. He was a highly educated man, and he knew exactly what this piece of paper meant for his immediate future. "If you attempt to put my daughter into that ambulance now, Dr. Aris," I continued, stepping aggressively into his personal space, "you are no longer executing a protected medical transport. You are actively participating in a premeditated felony kidnapping. You are attempting to forcibly detain a perfectly sane woman against the direct legal orders of her official medical proxy. I will not just sue you for gross medical malpractice. I will personally ensure federal investigators strip you of your medical license, freeze your corrupt bank accounts, and send you to a maximum security federal prison for the rest of your miserable life. The heavy plastic clipboard slipped from the doctor's trembling hands and clattered loudly against the crushed gravel driveway. The massive sum of money Cameron had promised him was no longer worth the complete destruction of his entire professional and personal life. Dr. Aris did not say a single word to defend himself. He turned his back on Cameron, scrambled past the confused private paramedics, and sprinted frantically toward his own luxury vehicle parked near the manicured garden. The sound of his car engine roaring to life and speeding off into the dark mountain night echoed through the sudden heavy silence of the courtyard. The two private paramedics looked at each other immediately, recognizing that their legal protection had just completely evaporated into the night air. They were highly paid contractors, not loyal soldiers willing to commit federal felonies for a spoiled real estate developer. They backed away from the heavy gurney, refusing to make eye contact with Cameron, and quickly climbed into the cab of the white ambulance. They threw the vehicle into reverse, backing carefully down the driveway, until they could turn around and escape through the open iron gates. Cameron stood completely alone on the crushed gravel, his grand master plan crumbling to dust around him. His chest heaved with panicked, ragged breaths as he stared at the legal document I was slowly folding back into my pocket. He had tried to play a ruthless game of legal chess with a man who had spent 40 years reading the fine print of massive federal contracts. I looked past Cameron to where my daughter was standing by the open front door of the mansion, tears of absolute relief streaming down her beautiful face. I walked past the defeated millionaire without saying another word. "Come here, Natalie," I commanded softly, taking her hand. "It is time to leave this toxic place." I opened the passenger door of my modest rental car and guided Natalie safely inside. She collapsed into the fabric seat, completely exhausted, the adrenaline of her near kidnapping finally wearing off. I closed her door, ensuring the automatic locks engaged before walking around the hood to the driver's side. The loud crunching of my heavy shoes on the gravel was the only sound breaking the sudden tense silence of the courtyard. The massive white ambulance had entirely disappeared down the winding mountain road, leaving Cameron Pierce standing completely alone in the bright glare of my headlights. His pristine, tailored clothing was rumpled, and his face was twisted into a terrifying mask of unhinged desperation. He took a few aggressive steps toward the hood of my car as I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. "You think you have won?" Old Man Cameron screamed, his voice echoing violently across the manicured lawns. "You think a single piece of paper is going to save her?" I watched him through the windshield, keeping my expression completely blank as I shifted the car into drive. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face, his chest heaving with arrogant fury. "I still have the signed asset transfer documents," he roared, his words practically tearing his throat apart. "I have her signature right here in my house. Tomorrow at exactly noon, my international investors are going to legally finalize the transfer of the 500 acres, and there is absolutely nothing you or your pathetic lawyers can do to stop it." I rolled my window down just a few inches, letting the cool night air rush into the cabin. "I am going to be worth $100 million by lunch tomorrow," Cameron continued, screaming, spit flying from his lips as he backed away from the rolling vehicle. "And the absolute first thing I am going to do with that money is hire the most ruthless corporate legal team in this state to completely bury both of you. I will sue you for kidnapping, and I will make absolutely sure you spend the final miserable years of your life rotting in a concrete cell while your daughter begs me for mercy." I did not offer a dramatic retort or attempt to correct his fatal misunderstanding of the situation. I simply rolled the window back up, sealing his desperate, frantic threats outside. I pressed my foot onto the accelerator and drove the rental car smoothly away from the grand marble steps, leaving the arrogant millionaire screaming into the empty night. As we passed through the massive wrought iron gates and descended into the dark valley, I looked at the digital clock glowing softly on the dashboard. The red numbers shifted quietly into the early hours of Monday morning. Cameron Pierce genuinely believed his empire would be permanently secured at noon. He did not realize that I had already bought the entire ocean he was drowning in, and I was simply waiting for the clock to strike 12 before I let the water pull him under. Monday morning broke over the city, not with the gentle warmth of a sunrise, but with the harsh, blinding glare of sunlight reflecting off towering commercial skyscrapers. I drove my rental car straight into the heart of the financial district, navigating the chaotic morning traffic with absolute cold precision. Natalie sat completely quiet in the passenger seat. She had slept for barely a few hours in my hotel room, but her face was no longer pale and drawn with terror. She was wearing a simple, sharp, tailored suit she had purchased from a boutique shop earlier that morning. She looked entirely different from the frightened, broken bride trapped in that mountain estate just 2 nights ago. Today, she was not a helpless victim waiting to be rescued. Today, she was a silent witness to an absolute corporate execution. We pulled into a heavily guarded subterranean parking garage and took the express stairs up to the street level. Our destination was the towering regional headquarters of Apex Financial. It was a massive, imposing structure made entirely of cold, black glass and polished, reinforced steel. It was the exact kind of heavy, brutalist building I used to design deep structural foundations for. I knew exactly how deep the concrete pillars had to be driven into the bedrock to keep a structure this massive from violently toppling over in the heavy coastal winds. But the people who worked inside this specific building did not build anything real or tangible. They were predatory institutional lenders. They constructed their massive wealth by identifying weak targets and crushing desperate men under the absolute suffocating weight of insurmountable debt. Apex Financial was the primary banking institution holding all of Cameron Pierce's original defaulted commercial loans. We pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors and stepped directly into the stark, chilling environment of the corporate lobby. The air conditioning was turned down to freezing temperatures, deliberately designed to make anxious visitors physically uncomfortable. The sprawling floors were covered in pristine white marble that echoed sharply and aggressively with every single footstep. Massive abstract paintings hung on the stark walls, entirely lacking any human warmth or relatable emotion. The entire space was meticulously engineered to violently intimidate anyone who walked through the doors. It was built to make a man feel incredibly small and entirely powerless before he even reached the elevators. I felt Natalie hesitate for a fraction of a second, her hand tightening slightly around the leather strap of her purse as we walked across the vast open floor. The sheer scale of the wealth in this room was meant to crush the spirit of ordinary working people. But I am not an ordinary man. I do not look at a massive skyscraper and feel intimidated by its imposing height. I look at the floor load capacities and calculate exactly where the critical load-bearing columns are secretly located, so I know exactly where to plant the explosives. I placed my hand gently on the small of her back and guided her forward with absolute, unwavering confidence. We walked directly up to the massive, polished granite reception desk spanning the entire length of the back wall. A young man wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit and a condescending smirk was typing rapidly on a sleek computer monitor. He did not bother to look up when we stopped directly in front of him. He simply raised a single manicured finger, silently ordering us to wait until he finished his tedious task. It was a classic corporate power play meant to establish immediate dominance over desperate clients asking for loan extensions. I did not tolerate the disrespect. I reached out and tapped my heavy, calloused knuckles hard against the polished granite counter. The sharp, cracking sound echoed loudly across the quiet marble lobby, forcing him to finally look up from his glowing screen. "Can I help you, sir?" the young receptionist asked, his voice dripping with barely concealed annoyance as he quickly scanned my simple, off-the-rack gray suit. He instantly categorized me as a low-level nuisance who had wandered into the wrong building. I am not here to apply for a consumer loan, and I am not here to beg for a mortgage extension. I stated my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of any emotion. I am here to see Richard Sterling, the Senior Managing Director of Commercial Debt Acquisition. Tell him Vincent Gallagher is standing in his lobby. The receptionist let out a short, mocking laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. Mr. Sterling does not take walk-in appointments from the general public, he sneered, leaning back arrogantly in his expensive leather chair. He manages institutional debt portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars. If you want to speak with a junior loan officer, you can take a number and sit in the waiting area. Otherwise, I am going to have to ask you to leave the premises before I call building security. I did not argue with the arrogant boy. I reached into my inside breast pocket and pulled out the solid black titanium card issued by my private Swiss financial consortium. I placed the heavy metal card gently onto the pristine granite counter. It made a dull, solid thud that sounded entirely out of place in the delicate, sterile environment. I slid it slowly across the smooth surface until it rested directly under his manicured hands. Look at the name engraved on the metal, I instructed softly. Then type my name into your internal global verified asset registry. If you do not pick up the phone and call Richard Sterling directly within the next 30 seconds, I will personally ensure your entire career in the financial sector ends before your lunch break. The young man looked down at the heavy black card. His condescending smirk faltered slightly. He reluctantly typed my name into his secure terminal, expecting to prove me wrong. I watched his eyes track across the computer screen. I saw the exact second his arrogant worldview completely shattered into 1,000 pieces. The color rapidly drained from his face and his hands began to tremble violently as he read the staggering liquid net worth securely attached to my private profile. He grabbed his desk phone, his fingers fumbling frantically over the buttons as he punched in the direct extension for the highest office in the building. Less than 2 minutes later, a pair of heavy security doors buzzed open with a loud electronic chime. A senior executive assistant practically sprinted across the white marble floor to greet us. She was breathless and entirely terrified, apologizing profusely for the brief wait. She bypassed the standard security checkpoints and escorted us directly into a private glass elevator reserved only for senior board members. The elevator shot upward with dizzying speed, carrying us toward the highest floors of the skyscraper. We bypassed the crowded cubicles and the mid-level management offices, completely ignoring the lower levels of the corporate machine. We were going straight to the absolute top of the financial food chain. I looked over at Natalie as the city dropped away beneath us through the thick glass walls. She stood tall, her chin raised high, ready for war. We stepped out of the elevator into a breathtaking executive suite overlooking the entire city. The digital clock on the wall read exactly 9:15 in the morning. Cameron Pierce was sitting in his downtown office preparing for his massive noon board meeting, completely unaware that the executioner had just arrived to buy the guillotine. Richard Sterling was a man who deeply understood the absolute power of extreme leverage. He stood behind a massive polished glass desk in his penthouse office, looking completely bewildered as my daughter and I through his heavy mahogany doors. The senior executive assistant had already frantically briefed him on the staggering liquid assets tied to my name, but my modest off-the-rack gray suit clearly confused his corporate sensibilities. He extended his hand, offering a polished, highly practiced smile reserved only for his most elite and profitable clients. "Welcome to Apex Financial, Mr. Gallagher," he said smoothly, gesturing toward the expensive leather chairs positioned in front of his desk. "I must admit, your visit is entirely unexpected this morning. We rarely see private investors with your specific level of capital walk through our lobby without a prior introduction from a major wealth management firm. How can my institution be of service to you today?" I did not shake his extended hand, and I did not sit down in his expensive leather chair. I stood directly in front of his desk, placing both of my calloused hands flat on the cold glass surface to establish immediate physical dominance over the room. I am not here to discuss your mutual funds. Richard, I stated, my voice completely flat and devoid of any standard corporate pleasantries. I am not here to diversify my portfolio or seek your financial advice on market trends. I am here to execute a highly targeted hostile acquisition of a specific toxic asset currently rotting inside your regional debt ledgers. I want to purchase the entire portfolio of defaulted commercial loans belonging to a local real estate developer named Cameron Pierce. Sterling blinked in absolute surprise, his polished smile faltering instantly as his brain processed the name. He walked slowly around his desk and sat down, opening a highly secure terminal on his computer monitor. Cameron Pierce, he repeated, his fingers moving rapidly across the mechanical keyboard. Mr. Gallagher, I strongly advise against this particular course of action. I am looking at his internal financial file right now, and his corporate structure is a complete unmitigated disaster. He is in severe default on 3 massive commercial properties. His luxury downtown penthouse is heavily leveraged, and his primary holding company has missed 4 consecutive payment cycles. We are actively preparing to initiate a total legal foreclosure on his entire life by the end of this week. His debt is completely toxic garbage. It would be a catastrophic waste of your capital to acquire this liability. I do not care if the debt is toxic, I replied, my tone turning into absolute stone. I am not buying it to make a financial profit. I am buying it to own the man. Print the total outstanding balance of every single dollar he owes your institution, including all late fees, penalties, and early acquisition premiums. I will pay you the entire staggering sum in liquid cash right now. I will transfer the funds directly from my private Swiss accounts before you even finish drafting the assignment of debt contracts. But in exchange for this massive sudden influx of cash into your failing quarterly reports, I demand the absolute legal transfer of all his promissory notes into my name immediately. Richard Sterling stared at me in stunned, suffocating silence. Institutional lenders spend months trying to offload toxic debt to bottom-feeding collection agencies for pennies on the dollar. I was offering to buy a massive failing portfolio at a premium in a matter of minutes. It was a financial miracle for his department, and he knew he could not refuse. He picked up his desk phone and immediately ordered his senior legal team to drop whatever they were doing and rush to the penthouse suite. The next 45 minutes were a blur of frantic, terrified corporate efficiency. A team of junior lawyers scrambled into the room carrying thick stacks of heavy legal binders and hastily drafted assignment contracts. They verified the origin of my funds, entirely terrified by the massive wall of liquid capital sitting quietly in my offshore proxy accounts. Sterling slid the final heavy assignment contract across the glass desk. The total acquisition cost was massive, but to me, it was simply the necessary price of heavy ammunition. I picked up the expensive silver pen sitting on his desk and signed my name with absolute steady precision. I pushed the document back toward him and tapped the screen of my encrypted smartphone, initiating the massive wire transfer. We stood in complete silence, watching his primary banking monitor. Less than 10 seconds later, the screen flashed bright green, confirming the international funds had successfully cleared and settled into the Apex financial holding accounts. The transaction was complete and irreversible. Sterling let out a long breath, wiping a bead of cold sweat from his forehead. He gathered the thick stack of original promissory notes, the heavy property liens, and the commercial foreclosure authorizations. He placed them carefully into a sleek black leather briefcase and handed it directly to me across the glass desk. "It is officially done, Mr. Gallagher," he said, his voice laced with a mixture of deep respect and genuine fear. "Apex Financial no longer holds any legal claim over those properties or those loans. You are now the sole and absolute creditor for Cameron Pierce. You own the debt on his business, you own the mortgage on his penthouse, and you hold the immediate, undeniable right to liquidate his entire corporate structure without any further warning." I took the heavy leather briefcase, feeling the absolute, undeniable weight of complete victory resting in my hand. I looked over at Natalie, who was watching the entire exchange with wide, amazed eyes. She finally understood exactly what I meant when I told her we were simply standing safely inside the blast radius. Cameron Pierce had spent the entire weekend violently threatening her with poverty and ruin, entirely convinced that his aggressive tactics made him an untouchable king. But as I walked out of that cold glass penthouse holding the absolute legal deeds to his entire existence, I knew the horrifying truth he was about to discover. Cameron was not a king. He was simply a desperate squatter living in a house I now completely owned. I checked the digital clock in the elevator as we descended rapidly back to the street level. It was exactly 10:30 in the morning. We had exactly 90 minutes left to travel across town, walk into his boardroom, and drop the heavy blade of the guillotine onto his neck. While I was standing inside the cold glass penthouse of Apex Financial, completely severing the financial lifeline of my new son-in-law, my forensic accountant was executing the second phase of our absolute destruction. Desmond Cole did not wear an off-the-rack gray suit like I did. He wore a custom-tailored midnight blue suit that cost more than a reliable luxury car. He walked through the heavy revolving doors of the downtown municipal court building with the aggressive, terrifying posture of a predator entering a cage full of completely defenseless prey. The county clerk office was a massive, sprawling labyrinth of slow-moving bureaucracy. Hundreds of ordinary citizens were sitting in cheap plastic chairs staring blankly at the digital numbered signs waiting for their turn to file simple civil complaints or register minor property disputes. Desmond did not pull a paper ticket from the automated dispenser, and he absolutely did not sit down to wait for his number to be called over the crackling intercom. It was exactly 10:45 in the morning. He had exactly 75 minutes to entirely freeze the 500 acres of commercial land before Cameron Pierce finalized his illegal cartel transaction at noon. Desmond bypassed the crowded waiting area and walked directly past the velvet security ropes meant to keep the general public at a polite distance. A heavy-set security guard stepped forward, attempting to block his path, but Desmond simply flashed a solid silver federal court credential. The guard immediately stepped back, entirely intimidated by the sheer absolute authority Desmond projected with every single step. Desmond moved rapidly down the long fluorescent-lit hallway, scanning the heavy wooden doors, until he found the specific department handling commercial deeds and high-value land trusts. He pushed the frosted glass door open and stepped into a smaller, highly specialized administrative office. The room was quiet, filled with the soft humming of massive copy machines and the rapid clicking of keyboards. But Desmond immediately locked his eyes on a young, nervous man standing directly in front of the primary processing window. The young man was wearing a cheap suit and a lanyard, identifying him as a junior courier for the specific boutique law firm Cameron used to manage his offshore shell companies. The courier was nervously tapping his foot against the linoleum floor, desperately waiting for the senior clerk to finish reviewing a thick stack of heavily printed legal documents. Desmond walked silently across the room and stood just a few feet behind the young courier. He looked through the thick, bulletproof glass separating the public from the administrative staff. A senior county clerk, a woman with tired eyes and heavy reading glasses, was sitting at her desk, holding the exact irrevocable asset transfer document my daughter had been forced to sign under severe psychological duress the night before. The clerk was holding a heavy red rubber stamp in her right hand, checking the final boxes on her computer monitor to verify the digital signatures. In less than 60 seconds, she was going to press that heavy red stamp down onto the paper, officially and legally transferring the pristine 500 acres of commercial land out of my daughter's protective trust and directly into the corrupt offshore holding company controlled entirely by Cameron Pierce. Once that county seal dried on the paper, the international cartel would legally own the property, and my daughter would be permanently buried under a federal money laundering investigation. Desmond did not clear his throat or politely ask for a moment of their time. He stepped directly next to the junior courier, invading his personal space with sudden aggressive force, and slammed a thick, heavy legal binder onto the narrow metal counter directly beneath the bulletproof glass. The loud, violently sharp crack echoed through the quiet office, causing the senior clerk to jump in her chair and dropped the heavy red rubber stamp onto her desk. "Do not stamp that document," Desmond commanded, his voice completely flat, cold, and radiating absolute lethal authority. "You are currently holding a fraudulent asset transfer obtained through severe psychological extortion and illegal medical coercion." The junior courier panicked, his eyes darting frantically between Desmond and the frightened clerk. "Hey, you cannot do that," the young man stammered, trying to push the heavy legal binder away from the processing window. "We submitted that paperwork through the expedited commercial channel. We paid the premium processing fee, and my boss needs the certified confirmation of the transfer by 11:30. You need to get back in line and wait your turn." Desmond slowly turned his head and looked down at the trembling courier with a gaze so entirely devoid of human warmth, it made the young man physically take a step backward. "My name is Desmond Cole," he stated, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. "I represent the sole legal medical proxy and the primary financial benefactor of the original trust holder. The man who sent you here today, Cameron Pierce, digitally forged 4 separate state zoning applications last month. He committed undeniable federal wire fraud, and he is currently attempting to use this municipal office to finalize a massive $20 million international money laundering scheme. If you touch my legal binder again, I will personally ensure the federal investigators list you as a willing co-conspirator in his federal indictment." The young courier instantly raised his hands in absolute surrender, backing entirely away from the counter and pressing his shoulders against the far wall of the office. Desmond turned his attention back to the senior clerk, who was staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. He opened the heavy legal binder and slid a single sheet of watermarked paper under the narrow gap in the bulletproof glass. "That is an emergency federal injunction signed directly by a federal judge less than 20 minutes ago," Desmond explained, tapping the paper with his index finger. "It completely freezes all assets, trusts, and property deeds associated with Cameron Pierce and his entire network of offshore holding companies. Furthermore, I have attached the certified medical power of attorney, proving that the signature on the document you are holding was obtained illegally, while the legal owner was under the threat of involuntary psychiatric confinement. If you place your official county seal on his fraudulent transfer today, you will not just be making a minor administrative error. You will be actively participating in a massive federal crime, and you will be subpoenaed to testify in a criminal court." The senior clerk looked down at the watermarked federal injunction. She recognized the absolute legal authority of the judge's signature and the terrifying reality of the situation immediately. She pushed the fraudulent transfer documents away from her as if the paper itself had suddenly caught fire. She began typing frantically on her keyboard, entering the federal injunction codes directly into the municipal database. A bright red warning banner flashed across her computer monitor, locking the property file completely. "The 500 acres are officially frozen," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly as she slid a certified receipt of the injunction back under the glass to Desmond. "No one can transfer, sell, or leverage this land without a direct order from the federal court." Desmond took the certified receipt and slipped it safely into the breast pocket of his custom suit. The digital clock on the wall above the clerk's desk shifted quietly to 11:15. The massive steel trap had finally snapped entirely shut. Cameron Pierce was completely locked out of his only remaining financial lifeline, and he had absolutely no idea that he was already a dead man walking. Desmond pulled his encrypted smartphone from his pocket and sent a single brief text message to my secure line. "The land is completely secured," the message read. "Proceed to the execution." While Desmond was securing the final lock on the municipal database, my daughter and I were riding a private elevator straight up to the top floor of Cameron Pierce's downtown corporate headquarters. It was exactly 11:45 in the morning. On the other side of the heavy frosted glass doors at the end of the corridor, my new son-in-law was already celebrating his imaginary victory. He was standing at the head of a massive custom-imported marble conference table in his private executive boardroom. The room was filled with the senior representatives of the international cartel. They were dangerous men wearing impeccably tailored suits who laundered millions through commercial real estate, but Cameron thought he was their absolute equal. He genuinely believed he had successfully played the ultimate game of high-stakes corporate extortion. He held a heavy crystal bottle of vintage champagne, pouring the expensive golden liquid into tall, elegant flutes for his lethal guests. He was smiling that perfect, charismatic smile, entirely convinced that the county clerk was currently stamping his fraudulent paperwork on the other side of the city. He raised his glass to the cartel representatives, loudly boasting about the incredible future of the 500 acres he was handing over to them. He promised them immediate groundbreaking access and massive untraceable profits. He was completely intoxicated by his own arrogance and the desperate illusion of his absolute power. He stood laughing with men who would not hesitate to end his life if they knew the truth. He did not know that his corrupt private doctor had fled into the dark mountain night, terrified of losing his medical license. He did not know his trapped bride had walked freely out the front door of his estate, completely unharmed. He did not know the property deed he was toasting to was permanently frozen by a federal judge. And most importantly, he had absolutely no idea that the massive toxic debt he used to build his entire fake empire was no longer held by a slow-moving commercial bank. He checked the heavy gold watch on his wrist, watching the minute hand slowly tick closer to noon. He was simply waiting for his junior courier to call and confirm the successful deed transfer, so the cartel would officially release the remaining millions into his starving corporate accounts. He took a long, arrogant sip of the vintage champagne, relishing the sweet, cold taste of his ultimate triumph. The heavy frosted glass doors to his private boardroom were the only things separating his fragile imaginary kingdom from the brutal, crushing reality I had just built for him. I stood in the quiet hallway, with Natalie listening to the muffled sounds of their premature celebration. I checked my encrypted phone one last time and read the final confirmation message from Desmond. I took a slow, deep breath, smoothing the lapels of my cheap, off-the-rack suit jacket. It was exactly 11:50. It was time to show the arrogant millionaire what happens when you try to steal from a man who builds indestructible foundations for a living. The heavy digital clock on the corridor wall silently shifted its bright red numbers to exactly 12:00 in the afternoon. Inside the executive boardroom, Cameron Pierce raised his crystal flute of vintage champagne to his lips, entirely ready to seal the fraudulent pact with his international investors. He was waiting for the vibration of his encrypted phone to confirm the county clerk had stamped the paperwork, making him a completely untouchable man. Instead, he got the absolute destruction of his entire world. The heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom did not politely click open. They were violently pushed wide open, hitting the rubber wall stops with a loud, sharp crack that instantly silenced the premature celebration. Desmond Cole stepped into the room first. He did not look like a standard corporate attorney arriving for a polite negotiation. He moved with the terrifying, calculated presence of a legal executioner wearing a custom midnight blue suit that commanded absolute immediate authority. Right behind him stepped two massive federal fraud investigators. They wore dark tactical windbreakers with bright yellow agency letters printed across their broad shoulders, establishing their undeniable jurisdiction over the room. They spread out immediately, moving with trained precision to physically block the primary exits of the executive suite. Then I walked through the doorway with my daughter. I wore the exact same cheap, off-the-rack gray suit Cameron had mercilessly mocked at the wedding reception. But I did not walk with the hunched, defeated posture of a poor old pensioner begging for mercy. I walked with the heavy, measured stride of a man who legally owned the entire building. Natalie walked perfectly in step beside me. She was no longer wearing the heavy, terrified makeup or the submissive posture he had violently forced upon her in the mountain estate. She wore her sharp, tailored suit, holding her head incredibly high, looking directly into the eyes of the man who had tried to lock her in a psychiatric ward. Cameron froze completely, his arm still awkwardly raised in the air, holding the expensive crystal flute. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a pale, terrified ghost. His arrogant brain frantically tried to process the impossible sight standing in front of him. He looked at the federal agents, then at the ruthless lawyer, and finally his panicked eyes locked onto me. "What is the absolute meaning of this?" Cameron stammered, his smooth, charismatic voice violently cracking under the sudden, suffocating pressure. "This is a highly classified private board meeting. Building security should have never let you up here. Get out of my office right now before I have all of you arrested for corporate trespassing." The international cartel representatives, sitting around the massive marble table, did not say a single word to defend him. They were incredibly dangerous men who survived by instantly recognizing a fatal shift in power. They slowly lowered their expensive champagne glasses to the table and leaned back in their heavy leather chairs, watching the sudden confrontation with cold, detached calculation. They realized immediately that the ground was giving way, and Cameron Pierce had just become a massive liability. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic screaming. I simply walked past him, entirely ignoring his pathetic demands for building security. I stepped directly up to the center of the massive custom mahogany conference table. The international cartel representatives remained perfectly still, their eyes fixed entirely on my movements. They were apex predators, and they recognized immediately that the hierarchy of the room had just violently shifted. I reached into my cheap suit jacket and withdrew a single heavy manila folder. I did not slam it down in a fit of theatrical rage. I placed it gently onto the polished wood surface, letting the quiet thud echo through the absolute suffocating silence of the boardroom. Desmond Cole stepped forward and stood right beside me, opening the folder with cold, professional precision. He pulled out the first stack of heavily printed documents and spread them across the table for every single man in the room to clearly see. "These are the preliminary environmental zoning applications you submitted to the State Planning Commission 3 weeks ago, Cameron," I stated, my voice cutting through the heavy air like a perfectly sharpened blade. "You digitally forged my daughter's signature on every single one of these state documents and transmitted them across state lines to a federal agency. You did this to falsely secure early development clearance for the investors sitting at this table." The senior federal fraud investigator stepped forward, resting his heavy hand on the back of an empty leather chair. "That constitutes 4 undeniable counts of federal wire fraud." Mr. Pierce, the agent, announced, his voice devoid of any sympathy or hesitation. "We have already verified the origin of the digital signatures, and your private offshore servers have been completely seized by our cyber division. You are currently the primary target of a massive federal criminal indictment." Cameron staggered backward, his polished leather shoes slipping slightly on the expensive hardwood floor. He looked frantically at the silent cartel members, desperately trying to salvage his shattered illusion. "This is a complete lie," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at the folder. "I have the signed asset transfer document right here in my desk. The county clerk is stamping the official deed transfer right now. The land belongs to my holding company, and the deal is entirely secure." Desmond did not even look at him. He simply reached into his custom suit pocket and pulled out the certified watermarked receipt from the municipal court. "The county clerk did not stamp your fraudulent paperwork," Cameron Desmond replied, sliding the federal injunction across the table. "A federal judge completely froze the 500 acres at exactly 11:15 this morning. You cannot sell it, you cannot leverage it, and you absolutely cannot use it to pay back the $20 million you illegally borrowed from these gentlemen." The cartel representatives immediately stood up from the table, their faces hardening into masks of pure lethal intent. They realized they had been completely exposed to federal agents because of a stupid, arrogant child. Cameron began to hyperventilate, clutching his chest as the terrifying reality of his total destruction finally crushed his lungs. He realized he was not just going to federal prison, but he was going to be hunted by men who did not care about the law. "You cannot do this to me," he gasped, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for a way out of the trap. I still own this entire commercial building. I own a massive real estate empire. I will liquidate my properties and fight you in court for the next 10 years. I looked at him with absolute cold pity and pulled the final heavy document from the manila folder. It was the original assignment contract from Apex Financial, bearing my fresh signature. "You do not own a single brick in this building, Cameron," I whispered, sliding the final document toward him. "I bought your entire massive portfolio of defaulted commercial loans an hour ago. I am your sole legal creditor. You owe me every single penny of your toxic debt, and I am officially calling in the loans right now. I am foreclosing on this building, your downtown penthouse, and your empty bank accounts. You have absolutely nothing left to fight me with." Cameron stared at the assignment contract lying on the polished mahogany table as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but no sound came out. The absolute reality of his complete financial annihilation had finally bypassed his staggering arrogance and struck his nervous system. He fell backward into his heavy leather executive chair, his hands trembling violently as he looked up at me. I stood over him, resting my calloused hands on the edge of the conference table. I did not feel any anger or rage. I only felt the cold, mechanical satisfaction of a successful demolition. "You looked at my cheap gray suit and my calloused hands on the day of the wedding, and you made a catastrophic miscalculation." "Cameron," I began, my voice filling the absolute silence of the boardroom. "You assumed that because I did not wear expensive Italian tailoring or boast loudly about my investments, I was a weak, helpless old man. You looked at my beautiful daughter, and you did not see a brilliant, loving woman. You saw a piece of collateral you could easily extort to save your own pathetic life. I spent 40 years designing the deep structural foundations for some of the tallest commercial skyscrapers in the world. I know exactly what it takes to build an empire that can withstand massive earthquakes and hurricane winds. You have to dig deep down into the dark mud and drive heavy steel pillars directly into the solid bedrock. It is hard, brutal, exhausting work, and it is completely invisible to the people standing on the highest floors. But it is the absolute only thing keeping the entire massive structure from collapsing under its own crushing weight. I leaned slightly closer to him, forcing him to look directly into my eyes. "You did not build a foundation, Cameron." I stated, my voice perfectly level and entirely merciless. "You built a glittering, beautiful glass tower directly on top of loose, shifting sand. Your entire life is nothing but a hollow, elaborate illusion. The luxury penthouse, the expensive vintage champagne, the private security guards, and the sprawling mountain estate, none of it was ever actually yours. You leased the bricks, you borrowed the glass, and you buried yourself in toxic, high-interest debt to convince these dangerous men sitting at this table that you were a king. You thought you were an apex predator manipulating the financial system. But you are nothing more than a desperate, terrified child playing with matches inside a paper house. When you realized your fake empire was finally starting to sink, you panicked. You decided to steal my daughter's land to plug the massive holes in your sinking ship. You tried to use the absolute sacred bond of marriage as a weapon of extortion. You threatened to lock her in a psychiatric ward and permanently erase her voice because you believed you were entirely untouchable. You believed your aggressive timeline and your ruthless intimidation tactics would force my complete submission. But an engineer never fights a collapsing building by punching the walls. We simply step back, analyze the exact point of critical failure, and remove the final load-bearing pillar. I reached out and tapped the heavy assignment contract lying in front of him. "I did not just stop your fraudulent land transfer today, Cameron." I whispered the words, echoing like a death sentence in the quiet room. "I went deep underground, and I completely dismantled your entire financial existence. I bought every single piece of toxic debt you used to build your pathetic glass tower. I bought the mortgage on this building, I bought the loans on your failing businesses, and I bought the debt on your personal bank accounts. I did not just knock your building down, I legally foreclosed on the sand underneath it. You are walking out of this boardroom with absolutely nothing. You do not have a company, you do not have a home, and you certainly do not have a wife. The federal agents standing behind you are going to place you in handcuffs and escort you directly to a federal holding cell for committing massive wire fraud. And when you finally get out of prison in 10 or 20 years, you will still owe me every single penny of that debt. You will spend the rest of your miserable life working minimum wage jobs just to pay the interest on the empire I took from you. I stood up straight, adjusting the lapels of my cheap gray suit. The cartel representatives sitting around the table were watching him with cold, dead eyes, calculating exactly how they were going to recover their $20 million from a man who was now completely bankrupt. Natalie stood quietly beside me, her posture perfect, and her face radiating absolute peaceful strength. She was watching the monster who tortured her finally shrink into the pathetic, miserable coward he always truly was. "You are entirely finished, Cameron," I said, stepping back from the table. "Your fake empire is completely gone, and I am the man who turned it to dust." The international cartel representatives did not hesitate for a single second. They were men who survived by instantly severing ties with sinking ships, and Cameron Pierce had just become the most toxic liability in the city. They stood up in perfect unison, leaving their expensive champagne untouched on the mahogany table. They buttoned their tailored suit jackets and walked briskly out of the boardroom, completely ignoring Cameron as he desperately reached out to them, begging them to stay and fight. They vanished into the corridor, leaving him entirely alone to face the absolute devastation he had brought upon himself. The senior federal fraud investigator did not wait for the heavy glass doors to close before he made his move. He stepped around the massive conference table, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. Cameron tried to back away, his polished leather shoes slipping awkwardly against the hardwood floor, but there was absolutely nowhere left to run. The agent grabbed his wrist, twisting his arms roughly behind his back, and locked the cold steel bracelets tightly around his wrists. The sharp metallic clicking sound echoed loudly in the quiet room, symbolizing the absolute end of his arrogant reign. Cameron collapsed to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably, his perfect, charismatic facade completely shattered into a million pathetic pieces. Suddenly, the frosted glass doors were violently pushed open once again. Victoria Pierce stormed into the executive boardroom, her face flushed with aristocratic fury, and her heavy diamond necklace sparkling under the fluorescent lights. She had been waiting in the executive lounge expecting a triumphant celebration, but instead found federal agents swarming her son's corporate headquarters. She looked at Cameron kneeling on the floor in handcuffs, and then her furious eyes locked directly onto me. "You pathetic, miserable old man!" she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing with unhinged entitlement. "I do not know what kind of elaborate lies you told these officers, but my son is a multi-million-dollar real estate developer. I will hire the most expensive legal team in this state to completely destroy you and your worthless daughter." She lunged forward, raising her manicured hands in a desperate, violent attempt to physically claw at my face. I did not even flinch. Desmond Cole simply stepped smoothly into her path, easily catching her wrist and pushing her firmly back. "You are not going to hire anyone, Victoria." Desmond stated, his voice completely flat and devoid of any pity. "Your son did not just forge property documents to save his failing business. He illegally leveraged every single asset he could access, including your personal accounts. He used your entire private pension fund and the massive equity in your Napa Valley estate as blind collateral for his underground cartel loans. When Mr. Gallagher foreclosed on his debt 10 minutes ago, he legally foreclosed on you as well. You are completely bankrupt, Victoria. You do not own a house, you do not have a retirement fund, and your diamond necklace currently belongs to my client." The aristocratic fury completely melted from her face, replaced instantly by a hollow, suffocating terror as the crushing weight of their absolute ruin finally brought her to her knees right next to her sobbing son. 6 months later, the sprawling glass towers and manicured mountain estates were nothing but distant memories for the Pierce family. Cameron traded his tailored Italian suits for a standard-issue bright orange jumpsuit in a high-security federal penitentiary. The heavy steel doors of his small concrete cell slammed shut every single night, sealing him away from the wealthy society he had so desperately tried to manipulate. He spent his long, empty days scrubbing cafeteria floors for pennies an hour, entirely aware that his massive toxic debt was still waiting for him on the outside. He had absolutely no visitors. The international cartel had completely abandoned him the moment the federal indictments were unsealed, and his powerful corporate friends pretended they had never even met him. Victoria Pierce suffered an equally devastating fall from her aristocratic heights. The massive Napa Valley estate she had proudly lorded over was immediately liquidated by Desmond Cole to satisfy the outstanding cartel loans. She was forced to move into a tiny, cramped one-bedroom apartment in a rundown industrial neighborhood she used to mock from the back seat of her chauffeured town car. She spent her days sitting on a cheap fabric sofa, staring blankly at the peeling paint on the thin walls, clutching a plastic cup of cheap wine. The crushing weight of absolute poverty had permanently silenced her arrogant entitlement. They had tried to build a legacy on lies and extortion, and now they had absolutely nothing left but the suffocating reality of their complete ruin. Far away from the damp concrete cells and cramped city apartments, the morning sun rose warmly over 500 acres of pristine, untouched commercial land. I stood at the edge of the deep green forest, with my daughter breathing in the crisp, clean air. Natalie was not the terrified, broken bride who had been violently cornered in a dark bridal suite. She was completely radiant, standing tall, and entirely free, wearing a simple canvas jacket and heavy hiking boots. We walked together across the rolling hills of the massive trust she legally owned, completely unburdened by the terrifying monsters who had tried to steal her future. I looked out over the vast, beautiful expanse and felt a deep, quiet peace settle into my chest. The world is full of loud, arrogant men who believe that true power comes from expensive suits, heavy threats, and ruthless intimidation. They believe that raising their voices and forcing their will upon others makes them completely untouchable kings. But real, undeniable power does not need to scream or boast or trap innocent people in locked rooms. True power is the absolute quiet patience of a structural engineer analyzing a massive foundation. It is the steady, disciplined observation of a fatal weakness hiding just beneath the surface. Real power sits silently in the background, entirely unassuming and perfectly calm until a foolish man decides to strike the support beams. And when provoked, that quiet power does not just fight back. It completely and permanently brings the entire building down. The greatest lesson we can extract from this ordeal is that true power never needs to announce its presence. Arrogant individuals who rely on loud intimidation and cruel manipulation often build their empires on incredibly fragile foundations of debt and lies. They mistake fear for respect and assume their aggressive tactics make them untouchable. But real strength is quiet, patient, and deeply analytical. It is the ability to remain completely calm under immense pressure, study the exact structural weaknesses of your opponent, and dismantle their entire existence with a single perfectly placed strike. Never underestimate the quiet observer. Share this story with anyone who needs to remember that the loudest person in the room is always the weakest, and true justice belongs to the patient.